Chapter 780. Luo Nan's improved control system was a great improvement over the original Alter Spiderweb's extensive model of the victor notifies the loser and the loser dies. Luo Nan's own design ideas were added in. Now, his thought process had almost become instinctive. He paid more attention to rational control and had his own set of rules and laws. Right now, the new version of the Alter Spiderweb was like the cotton candy machine that he saw in the Museum of Life when he was a child. A small stick was stirred in the machine, and countless visible and invisible sugar threads were entangled, forming an amazing creation that was as white as a cloud. Luo Nan was that small wooden stick. He used the Luo Nan ruler to probe the heaven and earth, the universe, and the myriad phenomena of the human heart. He transferred and absorbed power from within. Regardless of whether the power came from the mighty force of heaven and earth or the turbid flow of the human heart, they were just crude raw materials that had to be broken and reassembled into sugar threads. Then, they would intertwine and form different clouds. With himself as the foundation, they would form a more delicate, dense, and sturdy structure. Heaven, earth, time, space, human nature, I am the central axis. Luo Nan was still a distance away from being able to completely control this power, but he was still progressing in the end. He had already gained a wealth of experience from Madame Halder, Cat Eyes, and the others. All he was doing was constantly searching for more effective configurations to utilize. Now, it was finally time to show his strength. Luo Nan took a deep breath, carefully adjusting the state of his fleshly body. In today's world, information traveled far and wide. Luo Nan's soul cloak covered the entire world. The control network built on this foundation could be said to be a natural gathering of power. Because of this, the vitality and yuan qi flowing on the spider web on the altar and the even more intangible soul power only accumulated for a short period of time, but it was already enough to make him, the mastermind behind the scenes who was taking advantage of the situation, eat too much. Now, the divine chakra and the body chakra were coupled, and the body and soul interacted with each other. Both were reciprocating each other, maintaining a basic balance. But as the accumulated power continued to rise, the upper limit of what his body could bear was also reached. If he continued to devour, there was a risk that the framework of his body and soul would lose balance. Fortunately, Luo Nan had made countless adjustments and experiments over the past few months. His body and soul frame had gradually grown accustomed to the pressure of this sudden rise. Even if there were still various inadequacies, it would be enough for the time being. Besides, to deal with Gong Qi, he had to give up something. Luo Nan suppressed his body and soul frame. It was hard to avoid some blood and energy anomalies. Yin Lu was trembling with fear as she watched from behind. In the end, she couldn't help but say, "Sir, are you sure it's okay? What problem can I have?" At this critical moment, Luo Nan's state of mind actually relaxed. He casually teased Yin Lu, "I see that you have quite a lot of questions. Do you want to ask?" Yin Lu was completely caught in Luo Nan's rhythm. Her mind was absent-minded, and she blurted out, "Where's the flying devil ray?" "That guy. I'll have to trouble you then." Luo Nan thought of something when Yin Lu mentioned it. He flipped his wrist and magically took out a crystal ball and held it in his palm. Luo Nan didn't even turn his head as he tossed the crystal ball behind him. The latter instinctively reached out to catch it, but he felt that it was as light as a feather and lacked texture, as if it was made of fine yarn. It felt very strange, so he raised it in front of his eyes and examined it with the help of the light from the projection. The crystal ball was about the size of a baby's fist. Like many similar products, there was a small object sealed inside that was still moving. Yin Lu took a closer look, and in the next second, her body stiffened. The devil ray. The object sealed inside the crystal ball was about half a centimeter long. It was very miniature, but it had wide wings and a long tail. It had a head fin on top, and its body was flat. It was a miniature version of the devil ray. Upon closer inspection, one could even see the electricity radiating from its tail. Yes, it was the mutated devil ray that Luo Nan had subdued. It was the vicious monster that caused the people of the inner world, even Xia City and Ban City, to be panic-stricken. But Luo Nan was the real monster for this kind of operation. Mister, this is? Yin Lu stuttered. It's that devil ray. But how did it? Well, I stored some seawater and fish in the ocean. I sealed it together with the devil ray into a spatial fault. Right now, this crystal ball is just a speculum. It will reflect the image within the fault. Don't worry about breaking it. It won't be able to escape. Luo Nan finally turned his head and gave instructions. However, there are some flaws in the design of the fault. It won't last long, and the environment is vile. That fellow is quite stifled inside. Also, I just strengthened it so its skeleton structure is a bit mutated. It needs to be nourished, so I need to let it out to get some fresh air. It just so happens that North Mountain Lake is a suitable environment. I'll leave this job to you. Yin Lu was stunned speechless. Luo Nan took it as her tacit agreement. He continued, in a bit, I'll map the exit onto the crystal ball. You just need to take it and wander around the lake a couple of times. You need to avoid the more troublesome territories of the mutants to avoid a fight between the two sides. It'll be too loud and draw suspicion. It was impossible for Yin Lu to refuse, but she still tried to figure out the core logic. How in the world did you do this? Luo Nan thought for a moment and replied, just do more questions. The results will be even better if you practice it for a long time. Yin Lu believed that Luo Nan was just casually answering her. Little did she know that Luo Nan was speaking the 100% truth. The so-called doing questions was none other than the general education level test simulation system that Luo Nan had dug out from the tree hole. To be more precise, it was the enormous question bank that the system was equipped with. Luo Nan was still unable to crack this simulation system. However, he had participated in the test over and over again. He was always able to see a few extremely ingenious configuration questions, and they were extremely well integrated with real problems. Over and over again, he was continuously polishing his thoughts. And the standard answers to these questions were tantamount to secret configuration techniques in a certain sense. Unfortunately, time was too tight. There were some opportunities that would never appear again once they were lost. There were some problems that would only become more thorny as time passed. He couldn't drag things on with the cloud world any longer. Luo Nan turned his head around and leaned against the sofa. He assumed a comfortable posture. I want to ask you about something. Huh? What do you think your boss will be able to do to break through the bottleneck of his cultivation? Yin Lu was more or less used to Luo Nan's drastic change in topic. She soon switched her field of thought and recalled Mrs. Halder's masochistic cultivation over the past half year. He can practically give up everything, including his life. Forget it. I'll just ask her directly. Luo Nan could completely sense Mrs. Halder's location through the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District and directly communicate with her. Yin Lu didn't want to participate in the specifics, but Luo Nan didn't have any intentions of hiding it. He just treated it as a phone call. He spoke word by word clearly. Mrs. Halder, there's an uncertain opportunity that may allow you to break through your shackles. Are you interested? Luo Nan switched to the projected image in front of him at this time. The configuration blueprint was replaced with an electronic sand table that covered the entire globe's topographic mapping information. Such a work was most likely from the military. It wasn't strange for Luo Nan to have a copy with his current status. But what use was he taking it out for? Luo Nan shrunk the electronic sand table to its smallest size. The highly realistic 3D image converged and slowly rotated in the virtual work area. It was as if the entire planet was placed in the palm of his hand. Then he tapped with his finger. Yin Lu was very familiar with the location he tapped at. T-City. Luo Nan chose Mercenary City in the Pacific Ocean. His mouth was still talking to Mrs. Halder. Of course there's a price. There's a possibility of death. Yin Lu really didn't know what Mrs. Halder's response was. But the smile on Luo Nan's face clearly indicated his inclination. Excellent. Then please make a long trip. Go here. Luo Nan rotated the Earth. From the deep blue Pacific Ocean, he instantly arrived at the plateau region of South-Central Asia. He lit up his mark once more, forming a dark red. You'll be pleasantly surprised. However, it most likely won't have a decisive effect. You need to wait. You also need some luck. What Luonen didn't say was that those two were also waiting high above the distant clouds. They also needed luck. It was just that these elements all needed to be controlled and given to by him. Snake Tongue's spirit body shrunk into a ball high above the clouds. She curled up in the yarn of silence, protecting a bit of her core. She also endured the nourishment and infiltration of external forces. Right now, it was Gong Qi's turn to inject vitality into Snake Tongue. It was just that the requirements for vitality on the spiritual level were too harsh. External forces could only treat the symptoms but not the root cause. Even if he poured in all his strength, it would be pretty good if he could use a single point out of 10 points. This required Snake Tongue's cooperation. But how could Snake Tongue possibly cooperate with him? Even though she was certain that Gong Qi needed to protect her psychic awareness from being extinguished in order to search for clues, it was impossible for her to escape unscathed now that her secret had been discovered. Snake Tongue's mental state was collapsing badly. She was certain, yet she was in despair, and she was rejoicing in Luo Nan's misfortune. Overall, Gong Qi was quite calm. At least he was calm in front of Snake Tongue. He had already come to a partial conclusion after a period of examination and deduction. He tried to communicate with Snake Tongue. Looking at your situation, it's very likely that there's such a person in the space and time where Earth is located. He should be proficient in soul summoning, and similar spells. Due to certain reasons, he discovered your hidden corporeal body. He also discovered your out-of-body situation. For some unknown reason, he used soul summoning to establish a connection with your soul through your corporeal body. After all, the marvelous connection between the body and the soul is unfathomable. It's hard to thoroughly investigate. Even if it penetrates the barrier of space and time and affects this cloud world, it's still unknown. Snake Tongue didn't respond at all. Gong Qi minded his own business and continued speaking. No matter what, it at least proves that the cloud world isn't a sealed-off world. There is a way to interact with the outside world. What we need to find right now is the trajectory of this interaction. That is also our path home. Two specks of ghostly flames lit up within the yarn of silence. It was Snake Tongue's ice-cold gaze. This path is already severed. The person you're imagining, even if there really is such a person, has already given up trying. Perhaps he's already discovered your ambush here. Not necessarily. Gong Qi laughed calmly. For him to be able to fuse your soul and body, his methods are indeed superb. But without a soul item like the yarn of silence as an anchor, I don't believe that he could conveniently extend his tentacles into this world. Under normal circumstances, who would think that such a marvelous plane of space and time existed? I'm more inclined to believe that he's currently making meticulous arrangements and preparing a new ritual. He's preparing to do more with your corporeal body. Snake Tongue recalled her dreamland experience, but she felt that it was completely different. She couldn't help but sneer. Secretary Gong is really... Halfway through her words, her divine sense was suddenly covered in a layer of hazy mist. It was as if a mirage was revolving around her, reflecting a marvelous scene. The dense mist didn't disperse. Chapter 781. This is it. Gong Qi caught the change in Snake Tongue's body in the first instant. His figure closed in, but he didn't interfere. Instead, he carefully observed the aftermath. But on the other side, Snake Tongue had a rather subtle feeling. This was because it wasn't quite the same as before. Her soul had split and a wisp of her soul had returned to Ban City. Instead, the Mirage Chi fog wall was growing thicker and thicker. Moreover, it wasn't only on the plane of her consciousness. It directly affected the material plane and appeared in the cloud world. Could it be as Gong Qi had said? That the powerhouse far away in Earth's space-time had made meticulous preparations these past few days and changed a method to work on her body? But why was there no pulling force between her soul and flesh for so long? Snake Tongue wanted to contact that person and seize the opportunity to issue a warning. She also wanted to beg that person to help her break away from the clouds and escape Gong Qi's control. No matter what kind of fate awaited her later, as long as she changed her way of living, or even how she died, she could accept it. However, that powerhouse on Earth didn't give her this opportunity. The Mirage Chi fog wall grew thicker and thicker. She hoped for Ban City and the fusion of her soul and flesh, but she still couldn't see a shadow. She didn't know what had gone wrong. Right now, Gong Chi drifted over and spoke to her. Just as he opened his mouth, his voice and transmitted thoughts suddenly became indistinct. It was as if there really was a thick curtain wall separating them, making them indistinct and indistinct. This was a situation neither Snake Tongue nor Gong Chi had expected. Before they could react, the Mirage Chi fog wall rumbled and surged. It erupted and flowed, cutting off their line of sight. As for Snake Tongue, she felt a heavy attractive force appear out of nowhere and act upon her spiritual body. In the blink of an eye, Snake Tongue and Gong Chi had unexpectedly become isolated from each other. Moreover, this attractive force, Snake Tongue. The brief thought was like an ice-cold thorn. It forcefully broke through the Mirage Chi fog wall and pierced inside. Snake Tongue's mind was muddled. Gong Chi instantly exploded with a chill that could nearly freeze her. He suspects me that this was premeditated? It would be great if there was. Because of Gong Chi's reaction, Snake Tongue suddenly had a flash of inspiration. She no longer cared about the other side. She didn't think too much, and she didn't care about her wording. She frantically radiated her thoughts and spirit waves, revealing everything that was going on in her heart. Save me. Save me. No matter what you want to do, no matter what you arrange, I don't want to die. I don't want to become a puppet. Save me. The Mirage fog wall completely isolated Gong Chi's figure and weakened his will, allowing Snake Tongue's courage to recover. The heavy suction force that had been in effect from beginning to end caused the hope in her heart to grow crazily. She tried her best to radiate her psychic waves, all for a response. Snake Tongue. Gong Chi's will penetrated the fog wall for the second time. Even though it was blocked by the Mirage fog wall, his killing intent was clearly transmitted, and then the fog wall shook. That was the impact from Gong Chi. The ice-cold emotions and the power of an extraordinary forcefully distorted the fog wall, allowing bone-piercing cold air to penetrate inside and create howling winds. Under this attack, Snake Tongue's spirit body was like a candle flame swaying in the wind. She could be extinguished at any moment. In reality, under such an impact, she had already lost the ability to think deeply. She could only instinctively continue crying for help, and there was no other reaction. It was also at this time that Gong Chi took advantage of the fact that he had yet to break through the wall of fog. He poured his thoughts into it, and the yarn of silence around Snake Tongue's spirit body began to exert strength. It suddenly contracted and compressed, attempting to cut off her path of life. My lord! My lord! Snake Tongue used the honorifics of Sakura City to continue crying and praying. Fortunately, the surrounding fog wall interfered with Gong Chi's control over the yarn of silence. She was able to slow down for a moment, and her already extremely weak spirit body contracted once more, barely condensing into a sphere of light. For this reason, she even abandoned a portion of her spirit body structure, thus obtaining a few seconds of breathing space. However, after a short period of breathing space, what Snake Tongue waited for wasn't a helping hand from her lord. Instead, it was Gong Chi's cold and gloomy voice. Aren't you thinking too much? A greenish-gray color rapidly spread above the Mirage fog wall. Everywhere it passed, the surging fog froze and lost its vitality. Soon after, the claw reached in, and the fog wall opened. Gong Chi brought out his true ability. The greenish-gray glowing fog that had been gathering and dispersing outside of his spirit body was the pure essence energy he cultivated with his life. It froze all the changes in the fog wall, causing it to shatter with a bang. Snake Tongue had already consumed a large portion of her vital energy. She was completely unable to react. She could only look on helplessly as the claw rapidly approached, about to crush her spirit body. But at this moment, Snake Tongue's consciousness blurred once more. The strange suction force that had been acting on her spirit body finally accumulated enough power. The quantitative change caused a qualitative change. Behind her, an incorporeal hole suddenly opened. The grayish-white color seeped out from inside and rapidly spread, swallowing her up before immediately contracting. There was only a thin line separating them, but Gong Qi's entire figure broke through the fog wall and pressed over. He also saw the spreading and shrinking colors, as well as the inconceivable hole in the clouds in the void. The hole wasn't large to begin with. It was just large enough to swallow Snake Tongue's extremely condensed spirit body. Judging purely by his eyes, he could at most extend an arm through it. Furthermore, it was rapidly shrinking. It looked like it was about to disappear into the drifting mist. Gong Qi didn't have time to think too much. His figure distorted into light and accelerated once more. He practically stuck close to Snake Tongue's spirit body and crashed into the hole together. The sky suddenly darkened. In the instant of this change, Gong Qi was already 100% certain that he could capture Snake Tongue. However, his mind inexplicably trembled. He didn't care about anything else. His spirit body that had transformed into light deviated and flew backwards. However, the whistling sand and dust filled the air. When he crashed into it, the hole he had just entered through had already disappeared without a trace. When he crashed into it again, there was only emptiness. Gong Qi was startled. Snake Tongue was only several meters away. It was like she was having an illogical nightmare. By the time she was slightly clear-headed, the shackles of the Veil of Silence were still there. Gong Qi was also there, and he was very close at hand. All the torment hadn't caused any fundamental changes. It was just that the bloody light and mist interweaved in the clouds had turned into a gloomy place where dust and mist surged. Where is this? She had been trapped in the cloud world for half a year. Chaotic clouds and bloody light were everywhere as far as the eye could see. Snake Tongue really wasn't used to suddenly entering a realm with a different hue. All she knew was that this wasn't the band city that she yearned for day and night. The dust and mist that fluttered in the sky shouldn't be the same as the fog wall that isolated her from the outside world. The powerful suction force had disappeared without a trace at some unknown time. Snake Tongue felt terrible. It wasn't just her emotions, but also her most intuitive feelings. Her spirit body was extremely weak. She had relied on a highly condensed method to prolong her life. But in this gloomy place, she felt that something was wrong. Her spirit body was erratic and unstable. Her core structure also showed signs of dispersing. She couldn't piece it back together no matter what. It seemed like in the next second, she would assimilate with the dust and mist that filled the sky. She would be torn apart and disintegrated. Chapter 782. A Trap. Gong Qi immediately responded to Snake Tongue. His piercing thoughts carried a bit of ridicule, but the direction he pointed at was rather subtle. I originally thought it was an inside and outside collusion, but now it seems I was overthinking it. That Lord of yours made you believe you could return to Band City and merge your soul and body. In the end, he gave you a glimmer of hope and deceived you. Because of this, he also deceived me. Especially when you were comparing the two, your mentality was unbalanced. You made a hasty judgment amidst an unforeseen event, and your brain became hot-headed. Hee, what a good plan. In this terrible situation, Gong Qi displayed his shrewdness and ruthlessness. He maintained his mentality quite well. At least in front of Snake Tongue, he maintained a calm attitude. He slowly moved over and looked at Snake Tongue, who was wrapped in the yarn of silence. She was shaped like a pearl of light, but she was even more fragile than a bubble. I never expected that there would be such a world beneath the boundless clouds. I deserve to be schemed against. But what about you, Snake Tongue? It's already hard to control your scattered spirit body. Instead, you have to rely on the yarn of silence to withstand it. It seems that Lord of yours doesn't take you seriously. In the end, you're nothing more than bait. After the big fish takes the bait, you're useless. Gong Qi's thoughts were like a blade. His words struck at the heart, and Snake Tongue's pearl of light fluctuated. As it swelled and shrank, it looked like it was about to shatter. In reality, her spirit body was heavily injured, and her spiritual will had suffered a blow. In addition to the vile environment, she was on the verge of death. Seeing this situation, Gong Qi furrowed his brows. He no longer provoked her. His previous words had been wasted. Gong Qi's original intention was to destroy Snake Tongue's mental defenses in one fell swoop in this desperate situation. He wanted her to remove the obstacle in her despair and fuse with the yarn of silence, removing the last hidden danger. This would make it convenient for him to focus all his attention on dealing with the great enemy. Unexpectedly, Snake Tongue was even more useless than he had imagined. In fact, it wasn't difficult to transform Snake Tongue into the yarn of silence at this moment. However, she was so weak that she was on the verge of collapse. She might not be able to withstand the impact of the transformation. Once the core structure of her spirit body was destroyed, what benefit would there be in swallowing her? If he wanted to satisfy both sides, he would inevitably have to focus his mind and do some meticulous work. This was simply an opportunity for the powerful enemy hidden behind the sandstorm. All sorts of thoughts revolved in Gong Qi's mind. In the end, he flicked his finger and sent a speck of light into the veil of silence. It changed slightly and poured some life force into Snake Tongue. It's better to keep it for now. After all, the connection between the soul and flesh is a clue. In this maze realm where the laws are in chaos and time and space are collapsing, I have to hold on to any thread. I can't lose it easily. But why hasn't the great enemy that lured me into the trap appeared? Ever since Gong Qi had entered this maze of sand and dust, he had been vigilantly searching at all times, attempting to use his mental senses to detect traces of the enemy, but to no avail. On the other hand, when he spread out his spiritual senses, they were tightly restrained and sluggish. This made him have some guesses. He casually picked up a grain of sand that was spinning past and carefully observed it. This particle was shaped like a grain of sand, but under the probing of soul force, one could see that its structure was so complicated that it made one's eyes pop out. It seemed to meander, it seemed to be transparent, it seemed like a layer, it seemed like a beehive, it seemed like the masterpiece of a miniature sculptor. When he tried to analyze it further and let his soul power seep in, there was a force within the sand that resisted and melted. Soon, the sand expanded slightly before shattering into even more indescribable fragments that mixed into the surrounding dust. He had seen this thing before. Gong Qi had already lived for nearly 100 years. He had experienced the vicissitudes of the 21st century, the age of distortion, the World War, the post-war revival, the construction of the inner world, and so on. The number of dead transcendents he had seen was several times more than the number of living transcendents. It wouldn't be a problem to say that he had seen and experienced a lot. His experience filled in his knowledge and helped him make judgments. Domain fragments. That's much more complicated, and there are far too many of them. Such strange objects weren't just 1 or 2 grains or 3 or 5 piles. Instead, they were scattered as far as the eye could see, boundless. Even if the crushed dust occupied an even vaster space, this quantity far exceeded the norm. Gong Qi tried to find the logic behind this exceeding the norm, and he quickly came up with a few guesses. It was these guesses that caused unprecedented waves to arise in his mind. What is this? Snake Tongue's thoughts drifted into his mind. She relied on Gong Qi's infusion of vital energy to forcefully stabilize her mind and awaken. She didn't want to mention the matter of food and bait again. She could only focus her limited mind on the key elements in front of her. Fortunately, she was close to Gong Qi and received some radiation effects. Otherwise, she would only be able to open her eyes wide and be blind in this treacherous area. Her weak soul force simply wouldn't be able to probe forward. Gong Qi straightforwardly answered Snake Tongue's doubts. This is a domain fragment. Fragment. Snake Tongue was absent-minded for a moment. Soon after, she emphasized the words in front of her. That's right. It's exactly what you think. If an extraordinary formed and solidified a domain in his peak state, then he was forcefully killed and his domain shattered. What remains is this object. Gong Qi smiled and said, I heard that you grew up in the Hachimen Temple. Back then, the Amaterasu orders swept through the archipelago. Those who complied with them flourished, and those who opposed them perished. I don't remember who that person from the main temple was. It said that he died in such a way. It seems that there are also such relics that are worshipped all year round. Perhaps you've seen them before. That's right. There were originally over 30 of them. However, they were the best divine objects for incantations. After repeated use over the years, they were eroded and worn away. When I left, there were less than 20 of them. Snake Tongue compared them to her memories. She matched them with great difficulty, but she was startled by the logic behind it. But there are too many here. According to this inference, how many extraordinaries had fallen in these scattered fragments? Hundreds? Thousands? Over 10,000? If this was truly the case, then all the extraordinaries since the era of distortion added together would be nothing more than a fraction. They might not all be the relics of extraordinaries. If it's a plane like the deep blue world or a half-plane of a lower rank, it's still unknown. Didn't some people say that in a certain sense, domains and planes can be equated? Take Ouyang Chen's so-called logic world for example. 100 or so exploded in one go. Perhaps it's on a similar scale. Perhaps we're in a shattered world fragment. Of course, there's bound to be an even more fundamental space-time structure outside the fragment. Otherwise, where would we find a place to stand? But even so, the rules of space-time have already been destroyed. It forms an enormous suppression on the strength of outsiders. It's a good place to set up an ambush. This level of knowledge already surpassed the scope of Snake Tongue's common knowledge. If she heard it on an ordinary day, she would certainly firmly remember it and think of every method to get to the bottom of it. But in this current situation, she could only remain silent. At this time, Gong Qi suddenly laughed. Amidst his laughter, he extended his hand. His lustrous and translucent spirit body structure sufficiently interfered with the sandstorm dust mist, rippling with spirit waves. After several attempts, he opened his mouth again. In any case, this is a secret land of enormous value. It can make all the apex scientists and research organizations that study space-time and planes go crazy. If it were me, I would hide this place tightly and not reveal the slightest bit of it. Then I would devote myself to research. But that person's methods are incomprehensible. Such meticulous planning step by step, and calculating our reactions perfectly. He's like a specter that hides by our side and monitors us for a long time. He knows our actions like the back of his hand, and he plans to target us. It wouldn't be strange for such a person to play any tricks. But he just had to use this part of the world as a trap. Moreover, he didn't make his move the instant we stepped into the trap. We missed a great opportunity. But Snake Tongue's train of thought was already led away by Gong Qi. That's because his strength isn't enough. Gong Qi directly concluded. Perhaps that person's treacherous methods are impossible to guard against, causing people to unconsciously raise their judgment of him. But the methods of doing things can't replace the rhythm, especially the bright rhythm that belongs to the strong. It's possible that everything is linked together, but it definitely wouldn't be as sloppy as it is now. Clearly, he's counting on this maze realm to reduce my strength. It's just a pity that he doesn't understand the matters of the extraordinary plane. Snake Tongue could feel that the identity of the person Gong Qi spoke of was already on the verge of being revealed. She wasn't willing to play the role of a supporting character, but the accumulated emotions dictated her words and actions. Even if it would be very difficult for her to leave this place alive, she still had to figure out the identity of the so-called Lord that was toying with her in the palm of his hand. Who is he? You still haven't figured it out? You need to properly adjust your mentality. In such a sealed environment, there shouldn't be any extra clues or extra people. Therefore, the most likely person is the one that sent you here. Amidst the low voice, a vague image was imprinted in Snake Tongue's mind. The outline was gradually corrected, and it gradually became clear. She was about to blurt it out. Of course, in her current state, a pure thought reaction was more direct. But at this moment, the speed of the sand and dust in the surroundings suddenly increased. She originally had a tiny reaction from Gong Qi's spiritual wave radiation, but it was also disrupted. For Snake Tongue, the surroundings darkened. She couldn't hear a single sound. It was as if her entire body had been thrown into an endless black hole. Her mind suddenly tightened. A second later, a dim ray of light flooded over and illuminated her surroundings once more. But the source of this radiating light was no longer from Gongqi. At the very least, it wasn't completely. At the border where the two layers of light interweaved, the fluttering sand and dust lost their usual trajectory. It seemed to ripple and distort, as if it were being grabbed by some invisible hand and pulled inward. Sand and dust rubbed and collided with each other. It even stimulated leaping sparks, forming a dynamic chaotic scene of alternating light and darkness. And in this chaotic background, there were several relatively clear silhouettes condensed from the myriad grains of sand and dust. They formed the relief of a human face. The eyes and brows seemed familiar, and the fierce and penetrating rays of light directly illuminated her. Under the stimulation of the rays, Snake Tongue's disturbed thoughts suddenly took form. Chapter 783. Luo Nan. Snake Tongue obviously remembered Luo Nan. After all, it was this person who had thrown her into that misty world and trapped her in a city of worry. However, after spending half a year in the clouds, day by day, that person's face had more or less become a little blurry. She could only remember that he was a somewhat neurotic youth. His way of thinking was very different from ordinary people, and his mouth was full of strange theories. Moreover, when his emotions got the better of him, he could do anything. In Snake Tongue's mind, Luo Nan was a twisted and grotesque figure. He was similar to some sort of symbol, representing a terrible road sign in her life. But at this moment, seeing the relief face condensed in the dust, the symbolic impressions suddenly became much more real. At least, this work in the dust and the whole process of its manifestation was deeply engraved in his mind, and it was difficult to forget. An exciting appearance. Gongqi's telepathic thoughts shuttled back and forth in the rays of radiation, on both sides, raising layers of tiny waves. Perhaps he wanted to disturb Luo Nan's sculpting process a bit, but in the end, it didn't happen. This thought only turned into a cold and heavy voice, appearing in the dust storm. In half a year's time, the growth of a young man is always astonishing. Luo Nan could not tell if this was an evaluation or a conversation. In any case, Luo Nan did not pay attention to it. Or perhaps this human face relief did not possess the ability to converse. Just as the long silence was about to devolve into awkwardness, Gongqi cleverly shifted the direction of the conversation to Snake Tongue. Illusions will always be shattered, right? Snake Tongue understood the meaning of White House's words. It was she, Tank, and a group of people who had burned the works of Luo Nan's mother. It was also Luo Nan's revenge that caused her to lose herself in the clouds and fall into her current predicament. She hated Luo Nan, and it was impossible for Luo Nan to forgive her. Given this premise, there wouldn't be the slightest bit of kindness in the fusion of spirit and body that gave her the greatest hope. Was it despair? Snake Tongue only remained silent. However, the silence was quickly broken by an external force. A thought that was different from Gongqi's penetrated in and restored a familiar voice in their consciousness. I'm sorry. The delay in long-distance communication here is much longer than I thought. Luo Nan. Gongqi's telepathic thoughts were severed as he responded. It's me. The so-called delay was completely absent from the conversation. Only the dust and sand billowed, and the human face relief in the middle steadily occupied a region. Moreover, it was obvious that a different kind of power had been injected into it. Even when the surrounding environment was in turmoil, it still showed very vivid details. This was especially so for the pair of eyes that were pieced together from an unknown amount of dust and sand. They opened and closed almost naturally, as if they were shining with a cold light. They projected hatred and murderous intent without reservation. Oh, I shouldn't have been so polite. What I should say is, old thief Gongqi, your time of death has come. Gongqi wasn't easily provoked into anger. Luo Nan's words and actions were very much in line with the temperament of a young man. However, how could a guy who could endure for half a year to set up an ambush and successfully trick him into a trap be a simple teenager? He continued to sense the surrounding environment, probing the real situation and probing Luo Nan at the same time. Is there only you here? The human-faced relief only stared coldly. Gong Qi laughed involuntarily. Yes, I can imagine. For Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong to take a fancy to him, there was no need to say more about his potential. From your ability to control this sandstorm, I can see about 70% to 80% of it. However, you're far from learning their magnanimity. You don't know how to share such a good place. Luo Nan's face within the dust and mist also laughed. He was most likely amused by Gong Qi's outlandish words. Share this world with you? What about Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong? Gong Qi strode forward. He was clearly treading on nothingness, but it was as if he was walking on a shady path. He was calm and at ease, at least on the surface. I dare to assert that you absolutely haven't told Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong about this secret. Otherwise, I would have run into those two long ago. That's true. A smile was drawn on Luo Nan's human face relief. He faced Gong Qi, who was gradually approaching, steadily and unwaveringly. Gong Qi spat softly. It's good for a young man to have perseverance and willpower, but if you do it too much, you'll become stubborn. Take you for example. What's the point of hiding this secret? You're just a watchdog that guards the door and eats. I wasn't able to enter before, but now that I've entered, what can you do? Luo Nan's response had just begun when a green-gray radiance suddenly flashed above Gong Qi's spirit body, who was less than 20 meters away. It was as if a rainbow light blade had cut through the air. It sliced diagonally across the human face relief, cleaving it in half. The human face relief collapsed, and the dust and mist sandstorm behind it exploded with a rumble. It formed a momentary turbulence, but it was immediately crushed by the even more tyrannical storm surrounding it. The exquisite work of relief was annihilated without a trace in the short span of a second. It really is a long-distance projection. But do you really think I can't see through your trick of crossing the sea and deceiving the heavens? The green-gray smoke flowed back around Gong Qi's body, swirling around his body. This was a layer of pure essence energy formed from the intersection of life and death. If Gong Qi could truly capture Luo Nan's location, regardless of whether it was his fleshly body or his spiritual body, Gong Qi would be able to pursue and infiltrate Luo Nan's body until Luo Nan died. As for that sneak attack that lacked the demeanor of an expert, he had already reached this point. Demeanor my ass. Gong Qi was already extremely decisive. Unfortunately, Luo Nan was much more cautious than he imagined. Luo Nan was also much more brilliant. Luo Nan was actually able to transmit power from a long distance within this sealed void. Luo Nan was even able to perform such exquisite work. From this, it could be seen that it seems that you've put quite a bit of effort into this maze realm for you to be able to twist the domain fragments into a flower. Moreover, there is certainly a special structural pattern. Did your arrangements in the surroundings come from this? But if you think that you can trap and kill me here with just this, you're indulging in the wildest fantasies. The green-gray smoke outside Gong Qi's body spread out once more as he spoke. Layer by layer, it seeped into the dust and mist sandstorm. Smoke and dust exploded everywhere it passed. Lightning was faintly discernible. It was vaguely similar to the scene of Luo Nan molding the human face relief. It was just that what Gong Qi made wasn't a tangible object that could be discerned with a glance. Instead, it was a layer of curtains that flowed along with the dust and mist sandstorm. The curtains were woven from domain fragments that were like dust and sand. What Gong Qi did was to eliminate the impurities and extract the essence, leaving behind only the structure that was useful to him. It wasn't as refined and detailed as Luo Nan's, but it had its own tyrannical laws lying across it. And all of this was under the control of Gong Qi's will. There are many things in the extraordinary level. Imagination alone is far from enough. Extraordinary. Domain. Snake Tongue recognized this powerful power that belonged exclusively to extraordinaries. She was also covered within the curtains. Although she was in her weakest state, and her active perception was practically non-existent, she was still somewhat sensitive to the radiance radiating in from the outside world. The probing situation of radiation radiating from both sides revealed a one-sided situation the instant Gong Qi established his extraordinary domain. The radiance that came from Luo Nan was simply crushed and covered, no longer leaving a trace. But then again, that face and that penetrating, fierce and penetrating radiance still lingered in her mind. It wasn't destroyed by Gong Qi's oppressive power. In fact, it became even more vivid. He's still here. This thought inexplicably flashed through Snake Tongue's mind. Before she could find a basis for it, an external force acted upon her and manifested on the plane of consciousness. Indeed, there are some things that I don't quite understand. The curtains erected by Gong Qi weren't able to isolate Luo Nan's telepathic transmission. At most, they formed a few insignificant noises. From Snake Tongue's perspective, this couldn't even compare to the confusion created by Luo Nan's words. From my understanding, the strength of extraordinaries, yes, I'm talking about the mental side, is mostly built upon the powerful grasp of the energy storm of the abyssal region, especially after establishing a solidified configuration. The stable and efficient energy utilization mode and interference mode can practically provide an inexhaustible amount of power. Constructing a so-called domain with its own unique rules on this foundation is just a test of logical ability. Am I right? Snake Tongue's train of thought had already been blocked by special terms like the solidified configuration. In comparison, Gong Qi was able to understand without any hindrance by combining his own experience. But it was precisely because he understood that he couldn't help but be astonished. Luo Nan was still underage. For this type of up-and-coming talent, it was already outstanding for his soul strength to reach the middle zone. But why did this kid seem to be so familiar with the abyssal region? Half a second later, Gong Qi discovered that he was astonished too early. Actually, I don't really understand the mysteries of the abyssal region. I also don't know where that majestic power originates from. I only know that the abyssal region is densely covered with undercurrents, just like the boundless ocean of the deep sea. But the sea is vast and has a boundary. I don't really understand the definition of a boundary. I just know that the power of the Earth's abyssal region doesn't naturally extend to the clouds. Here's the problem, Deputy Secretary General Gong. According to my observations, you've been affected by the sealed spacetime. It's hard for you to utilize the solidified configuration of the Earth's abyssal region. Your strength has been affected a bit, but you haven't reconstructed your configuration in the cloud end abyss region. Even if it's only a temporary one. But Gong Qi was silent for a moment before asking in reply, "Yeah, why?" "I'll call you an old thief because you haven't given up on your evil intentions. Every day, you sense the aura of the solidified configuration that belongs solely to you within the Earth's abyssal region. You pass through the polar domain. That place is high up and illusory. It's transparent and unobstructed. It's like the vacuum of the atmosphere. It isn't obstructed by the barriers of spacetime, especially with the sun rising from the clouds these past few months. With a reference, your sense of direction should be much stronger, right? If I give you a few more months of time, who knows what you'll be able to do?" Gong Qi didn't speak again. In this moment, he restrained all the meaningless reflections of his expression. He just stared with a heavy gaze at the howling dust mist and sandstorm outside the tent. It was as if he wanted to capture the image of Luo Nan's existence from within. Luo Nan's human face relief had been chopped to pieces by Gong Qi, but the lines of the young man's eyes and brows were carved into him bit by bit through these difficult and heart-piercing words. Some of them had even broken his flesh and splashed blood, burning with pain. Chapter 784. Was that really Luo Nan in front of him? Gong Qiling's thoughts interweaved and changed. He instinctively wanted to change his previous judgment. This was because what he had experienced so far had already broken away from the common sense constructed over the course of his nearly 100 years of life. A young man who had just stepped into the inner world circle, had a deep understanding of the abyss region and the polar realm. It could be explained as a parroting, used specifically to deceive others. But how did Luo Nan accurately grasp the activity of his mental senses come about? Even if it was not completely correct, there was no problem in grasping the trend. Even Gong Qiling himself had never thought about how to grasp the movement trend of a mental type extraordinary without alarming the target. Aside from years of patient observation and meticulous analysis, there was certainly an extremely high-end observation method. Was there such a method in this world? Was that kid really just a little doggy who overestimated his own capabilities and protected his own food? Were the shadows of Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong hiding behind him? That wasn't right. This wasn't the style of those two at all. Gong Qiling's thoughts were a chaotic mess for a time. There was no fixed conclusion. When he first came to Xia City, he had gone for the exchange of benefits. The 2,000s of Deep Blue's shares and the absolute secret behind Wang and the Order of Justice's actions were the things he valued. As for Luo Nan, he just happened to be in a crucial position. He needed to gather information from there. He did not place much importance on him. He just wanted to look at the information. Even though he had fallen into the cloud world and struggled to get out, he had no way of figuring out Luo Nan, a key character. Now that the two sides had collided, he confirmed once more that his understanding of this young man was far from enough, especially when he relied on common sense and logic. It was hard for him to reach a normal conclusion. It was like he had bumped into a dense fog of nothingness. He was completely unable to ascertain what was inside. Perhaps it was empty. Perhaps it was filled with poison. Perhaps it was mixed together with the dust, fog, and sandstorm. The enemy knows me, but I don't know the enemy. There was nothing worse than this from a purely situational point of view. As his thoughts changed, the tent that was spread out within the dust, fog, and sandstorm slowly retracted, representing Gong Qiling's gradual change in attitude. He needed to gather more information. He needed to have more conversations with this young man. With this thought, the noise caused by the interference of the domain was greatly reduced, and the other's thoughts were transmitted again, seemingly ready to have a long talk. Actually, I feel that there is another reason why you haven't reconstructed your solid configuration in the cloud world, other than eliminating the interference. I'm not an extraordinary. This is just a wild guess. You can evaluate it and see if it's correct. Gong Qi appeared to be quite interested. Tell me about it. I'm just thinking that maybe Deputy Secretary General Gong wants to recreate the solidified configuration of the abyss area on Earth in this cloud world, but he's not willing to, but he can't. For a moment, the curtain that was floating in the dust storm froze. The manifestation of Luo Nan's telepathic thoughts grew clearer and clearer. It should be the effects and limitations of the fleshly body. According to the sparse knowledge I have regarding extraordinaries, the balance of the structure of body and soul, as well as the relationship of interference, are extremely important. Even for the mental side, the accumulation of the fleshly body is very necessary. Correspondingly, if I were to form a solidified configuration in the abyss region, both the body and the soul cannot be neglected. In this case, if the connection between body and soul is severed, it would be a rather troublesome matter to start anew. A single mishap would result in a conflict between the two, and the foundation would be damaged. Therefore, you'd rather expend a bit more effort to temporarily organize and operate the structure in the clouds. You'd give up a few highly effective methods in order to ensure the purity of the foundation. This way, you can avoid the consequences of creating an odd shape. Of course, these are all my guesses. I still need to verify them. Based on the principle of body and soul cannot be neglected, my spiritual body can't court death in the cloud world. My fleshly body can't cause any trouble on Earth. Admittedly, this is stable, but without stimulation, the progress isn't too ideal. Speaking of which, Deputy Secretary General Gong has been away from Earth for half a year. Do you know what the situation is over there? What situation is Chan City? Yes, and what situation is the island where you're hiding in seclusion? Gong Qi's spiritual body's pupils congealed like ice when he heard these three situations. At this moment, he even wanted to create an explosion and completely crush the young man who was still hidden behind the nothingness. But he didn't do that. The young man's thoughts were still transmitted, but it no longer turned into vibrating sound waves. Instead, it controlled some of the sand and dust, as if it was going to remake the human face sculpture. No, it was going to look different. The outline of the image was zigzagging and disorderly. After spreading out, looking at the familiar distribution of land and sea, it was clearly a map of the world. Moreover, as the details were carved, the image gradually changed, showing more detailed and realistic curvature. A few seconds later, it had curled into the shape of a miniature Earth about half a meter in diameter, spinning silently in the sky full of sand. Suddenly, the temporary globe stopped spinning, and the slightly concave area that corresponded to the Pacific Ocean was facing Gongqi. To be precise, it was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the seemingly inconspicuous archipelago area. After another half a second, the entire sphere greatly swelled and deformed, thus achieving the effect of zooming, highlighting the details of a special area in the archipelago area. It's here, right? This is the feast that I've prepared for you for half a year. Please enjoy it. Boom! Gongqi finally did what he had always wanted to do. He created an astonishing explosion within the sandstorm of dust and fog, tearing apart the globe used for the demonstration. He also crushed everything within the range of his power, everything that was not pleasing to the eye. The problem was that no matter how berserk Gongqi unleashed within the misty labyrinth in the distant clouds, no matter how violent his attacks were, no matter how violent his emotions were, he was unable to find a way out before the barrier that separated the two places. The power he stirred up was destined to be unable to affect the local spacetime of the Earth in the slightest. So, Luonan's posture didn't change at all on the Ray yacht at Northern Mountain Lake. He really hadn't cast his true body, including his spiritual body, into the cloud world. He would rather spend a bit more energy to communicate with his projection. Gongqi's words were correct. It was impossible to trap and kill him like this, but there was still a follow-up. Luonan wasn't just trying to scare Gongqi. Yin quietly walked in and delivered fragrant coffee. At the same time, she spoke by his ear, "The madam has already arrived at the predetermined location." "I know." Luonan looked at the time displayed in the lower right corner of the projection area. Today was May 2nd, Thursday. It wasn't a special day. The students of Acumen College were all in class, and he was quite unqualified as an older brother. He urged his little sister to skip class. Ruiwen had arrived at the underground laboratory of gear early in the morning. She had organized all of her equipment, and when Luonan's command was issued, she held onto the assembly box that was taller than her head. She lowered her head slightly. She abandoned her own senses at this moment, allowing Luonan's soul cloak's vast field of view to replace her. She relied on the soul cloak's positioning to lock onto the location of the volcanic archipelago in the middle of the ocean from a distance of 8,000 kilometers away. Chapter 785. In April and May, Chan City was considered the lightest season of the year. The dry season had just begun, so hurricanes were rare. The seas on the island were calm, and there were very few tourists. Even the most deadly rush tide was missed. Because of this, this period of time was affectionately called seclusion season by the members of the headquarters. Since the end of March, a considerable number of ability users had applied to enter Volcano Island for seclusion. It wasn't overcrowded, but at the very least, the seclusion rooms on the island, especially those high-quality areas, were in short supply. These days were painful and happy for the senior security expert Wolf, who was also the head of the security team. He would always miss the best time for cultivation because of the heavy duty on duty, but he would get some extra benefits because of his key position. Relying on this unique circumstance, he became a veteran B-class expert. However, perhaps it was also because of this circumstance that he was still a veteran B-class expert. It was currently the middle of the afternoon in Chan City. The weather wasn't too good. It had been raining since the morning. It was different from the torrential rain that usually passed by in a moment during the day. The rain was intermittent. Wolf felt a bit uncomfortable after being cooped up in his room for a long time. He took his two subordinates and patrolled the island reef area, checking the security equipment and the situation of the enchantments. The island reef area was filled with powerful people from the society and various powers of the inner world. Many people had taboo when it came to cultivation, so there were all kinds of restricted areas. Things like entering and flying were prohibited. The rules were very strict. Even the security team had to follow them. It wasn't easy for them to walk around, so they relied on idle chatter to get by. Before this, The hot headlines of Xia City and Saka City had given them something to talk about. They also calculated that with the speed of the Flying Devil Ray, it would only take 2.5 hours to get from Xia City to Chan City. Next, Assistant A gestured on the security zone map. While chatting, he pointed out, luckily, Langdon can finally avoid the 13th zone this year. Assistant B whistled. Then after the qualification test, he'll have to find a new number. How tiring. Wolf knew the tricks of his two assistants, so he said, next, we'll go to the 13th zone. Assistant A and Assistant B groaned, Captain, for the sake of the weather. We'll go through the 13th zone and pass quickly. The two assistants' worries turned into joy. Oh, smart, no, brilliant. Repairing equipment and wards had always been hard work. The equipment was fine, but when it came to high-end wards, well, it was more popular nowadays to call it configuration knowledge. It always gave the security team a headache. Wolf was an expert in this field. He knew the importance of daily patrols for security work, but since there was no one in District 13 this year, there was no need to torture his subordinates. The patrol was coming to an end. The three of them chatted as they moved forward. They naturally talked about the reason why the 13th sector was empty this year. Assistant A casually clicked on last month's report. It's been more than 4 months. The legendary plane is still a legend. Volcanic Island's quarterly income has dropped by almost 5%. Now, those bosses would rather drink the wind in the Pacific Ocean than come back to meditate and train. Rolf calmly replied, high-level seclusion areas are still in short supply. Moreover, extraordinaries can use it for free, but B-class and below don't have such treatment. Hey, Captain, year-end performance has nothing to do with rent. In terms of consumables, extraordinaries crush architects. Architects are also different from awakened ones. But you have Langdon. Not just one Langdon. This sentence made Assistant A choke back his complaints. Rolf didn't say anything more. If he continued, it would involve the security team's gray income area, which wouldn't be good for anyone. He had been on duty at Volcanic Island for 3 years. It was very likely that he would be transferred at the end of the year or early next year. There was no need to be the bad guy for this kind of thing. He returned to the topic of searching for a new plane. In the South Pacific region, there are endless clues about a new plane. Deputy Secretary General Gong's aura is like this rain, appearing and disappearing. It said that there are also traces of ape-like creatures unique to that plane. It's only right for the boss to go and search. At least it can shut those busybodies up. Assistant A was a bit gossipy. Along the way, I heard that Toyama Auction House is very generous. Will President Abner and the others attend the Jade Lights High Seas auction? Toyama doesn't have that much influence. But someone did. Rolf gave an ambiguous answer and then said, because of this, Chan needs 2 more layers of blankets when it catches a cold. There are city guards in the main city, but there's only us on Volcanic Island. If any mutated reptiles crawl in, Assistant B shuddered. It will face the anger of hundreds of architects and even extraordinaries. If they do, I can deduct your performance right now. Pretend I didn't say anything. Assistant B also shut up. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. In the end, he couldn't help but complain. The association needs to hire a professional manager for Volcanic Island. How about poaching from intercontinental hotels? Due to the special function of Volcanic Island, there was a phenomenon of the strength of the users and the defenders here being inverted. The security team inevitably changed to a service type, providing consumables, maintaining the barrier, and at most providing the first wave of warnings. In short, he was just an assistant. His responsibility was greater than the heavens, but the one doing the work was an ant. It was fine if nothing happened, but once something did happen, he would be the scapegoat. No matter how rich the gray income was, Rolf did not have any attachment to it. After chatting for a while, he thought of business. Remember the partial upgrade in 2 days? How could I forget this? Assistant B bent his finger. Upgrading Mr. Gong Chi's seclusion area. The constructor is Ms. Dollar, and the inspector is President Abner. There are 3 extraordinaries. Choose one out of the 3. No matter which one you choose to provoke, it'll be a dead end. But isn't this a compulsory topic? Assistant A responded coldly. It said that Mr. Gong seemed to have chewed a large piece of raw mustard at the consultation meeting last week. If Deputy Secret Director Gong comes back, it might be our turn to eat mustard. At this point, the conversation became a little awkward. They all knew that the so-called upgrade of the seclusion area was the installation of visual monitoring and interference precision perception systems. In other words, it was to carry out omnidirectional surveillance without any blind spots. Be it in terms of privacy or safety, this was unacceptable to any seclusion person, let alone Gong Chi, the Deputy Secretary General of the Association. However, Gong Chi had been in seclusion for too long. It was almost certain that his soul had left his body and entered another plane. What was left in the seclusion area was only an empty shell of a physical body. In this state, he couldn't raise any objections. And under the stimulation of the benefits of the new plane, the attitudes of his various relatives, friends, and allies became more and more ambiguous. Until the upgrade motion was passed. Regarding this, Wolf, the natural scapegoat, was worried. I hope the end of the plane incident can be delayed. It would be more appropriate for me to resign next year. Of course, if there was a breakthrough in these 2 days, there wouldn't be a need for this. It would be a perfect dream. Sighing, he raised his head, and a dark red stream of light flashed above his head. He made a wish at the shooting star. Huh? Wolf's eyes widened to the point that raindrops dripped into his eyes. Yes, there were still dark rain clouds above his head, but that light, his bracelet vibrated, and the security warning system lit up with a yellow light, which meant that a non-direct threat was approaching or had been nearby. Wolf raised his head and spoke to his men in the duty room. Report the target. Boss, a high-energy ray shot down from the sky, brushed past the no-fly zone in the 4th zone, and drilled into the bottom of the sea. It's about 30 kilometers away from the island's warning line. Maybe it's a high-power laser. Is there any damage to the barrier? There's a hole, but it can repair itself. Ask Chan's garrison if there are any related exercises. Definitely not, or we would have received the news. What about the Star Alliance? Their space fleet? When those people were cleaning up the space junk, the main cannon would occasionally fire. At least that's what the public report said. The military committee's consultation platform is habitually disconnected. Oh damn. The man in the duty room spoke more quickly. There's a strong reaction at the bottom of the sea. The energy index, no, there's interference reaction at the swamp area. The instrument average is 1.7 dg, and the extreme is 2.3 d. Preliminary estimate is a fully evolved B-class mutant. Beside him, Assistant A said, if it's a B-class individual, there's no threat. Mutants often pass through the surrounding waters. Maybe they were stimulated by the laser? Maybe. Wolf was already numb to these kinds of things. He didn't even need to think, and a plan popped up in his mind. The self-healing of the barrier is too slow. Group 4, deal with it. As for the sea, take the image first and prepare the inducer. It's best if there's no conflict. But if there are some ladies and gentlemen who like specimens, we can consider it later. As he spoke, the originally pitter-patter of rain became heavier, and a thin layer of fog had appeared between the islands. The wind blew the rain, and the fog assaulted their faces, slightly obscuring their vision. Wolf exhaled with the intention of blowing the fog away, but for some reason, the flow of the fog was not disturbed at all. It was a strange contrast to the strands of rain that were deflected by the force. Wolf was stunned. He suddenly felt a sense of déjà vu, as if he had experienced this before. It was also at this moment that the underwater camera equipment set up in the distant waters moved into position and transferred the image of the mutant that had suddenly appeared over. The moment the image appeared, Wolf made a clear judgment. This thing doesn't look like a marine mutant. It looks more like a big ape. As soon as this thought rose and fell, the ape creature with a body as dark as blood leaped into the sea and instantly escaped from the surveillance area. At this time, the man in the duty room followed up with a report. The target mutant jumped out of the sea. It's calling. There was no need for his subordinate to say anything more. Wolf could already capture the powerful shockwave that was pressing in from afar. It wasn't just the energy transmission of air molecules, but a powerful turbulence that involved the level of the swamp area. It had astonishing penetrative power. Even though it was weakened by the barrier of the islands during the transmission process, there were still aftershocks that seeped through. For a moment, the security system's alarms rang incessantly. It was unknown how many barriers and warning systems in sensitive areas were activated. Chapter 786. That ape was provoking him. Maybe the lasers from the sky had disturbed its sweet dreams, or maybe it was some other inexplicable reason. Whatever it was, the ape's attitude was very unfriendly, and it had brought Wolf a lot of trouble. At this time, he had already forgotten where his sudden thoughts were pointing. More than 30 alarm signals converged into the security system at the same time. It was as if a great enemy was invading. In each of the seclusion areas, some of the more sensitive residents began to inquire the duty room, some sent out detectors, and some even called Wolf directly. The continuous vibration of the wristband disturbed his pulse, and the flashing names that could not be messed with almost gave him a heart attack. Reset the warning signal system. Also, F*King Inducer. Team 1, get rid of that thing. Before he finished, a roar that connected the abyss and the material plane boomed over again, obviously causing another wave of chaos. Assistant B slapped his forehead. That ape must be in heat. It's an ape-like creature because I don't see a tail. Assistant A's biological foundation was obviously more solid, and it was one of the words he said that stirred Wolf's emotions again. He suddenly stopped and turned to stare at Assistant A. Say it again, the one in front. I don't see a tail. Further ahead? Ape-like creature? It was a simple phrase, but it was like a bolt of lightning striking Rolf's mind. The rumor hidden in the depths of his memory was reflected together with the current situation. Ape-like creatures, new dimension, ape-like creatures. What? Because the topic was too sudden, the two assistants did not understand immediately. Wolf did not care about them. The rumored clue that appeared in the South Pacific region, why would it be here? But then again, it was meaningless to think about these reasons now. After all, this was the place where the clue to the new dimension first appeared. So what if they fought a cycle in half a year? Wolf did not think about the complicated factors behind it. He only knew one thing. This was a pie falling from the sky. He raised his wrist abruptly, and through the wristband he ordered Team 1, who should have gone out to hunt. Capture it alive, we must capture it alive. I'll be right there. Before he could finish, Wolf suddenly choked. It was as if a thin electric current had swept across his scalp, and his hair stood on end. Under the gloomy sky, a circle of jade-green light clearly lit up, causing the sky to lose its original color. That was the result of the activation of the main enchantment buried on the volcanic island. The control of the main barrier was still in Rolf's hands, and he definitely did not give the order to activate it. Aside from President Abner, there was also Madame Dale. For the sake of the project that would take place 2 days later, she did stay on the volcanic island and was the first to notice the change. The report from the duty room came 2 seconds late. Wolf did not say anything. He only asked the other side to turn on the panoramic image formed by many observation points. It could be seen that the green spiritual light of the barrier that the important areas of the islands and reefs were giving off was concentrated on the surface of the sea, like a bunch of grapes that had just been picked and placed on a grayish-blue porcelain plate. They were translucent and seemed to be alive. Compared to a few seconds ago, the strength of the barrier was more than 10 times stronger. Moreover, as everyone knew, as the top barrier grandmaster in the inner world, Madame Constance Dale was never a conservative person. Compared to hiding in the barrier and passively resisting, she preferred to use unimaginable barrier spells to set up an inescapable net and hunt to her heart's content. From Rolf's point of view, under the gloomy sky, there was a dark golden light twisting and turning. After it took shape, it rapidly enlarged. It could be seen that it was the mysticism symbol of a single circle pentagram. With this symbol as the core, dozens of identical yet different circles extended in all directions. They were connected by straight lines and arcs of light, and there were also indecipherable runes flowing among them. This strange, gorgeous, and complicated diagram instantly connected the energy passageway between the spiritual and material planes. The turbulent storms of the abyss area and the ceaseless flow of energy in the material world converged here. Even from dozens of kilometers away, one could vaguely feel that the flow of air and the waves of the seawater had instantly become stagnant. It was as if the legendary time-stop magic had been cast. It was a treacherous contrast to the surrounding area. If the sea and the void were like this, then there was no need to mention the monkey, no, the ape-like creature trapped within. The provocative howl came to an abrupt end. Madame Dale has made her move. The team leader of Team 1 reported in a suppressed voice. He unconsciously exerted force, causing his voice to tremble. We can't go through. Stay where you are. No, stay further away. Rolf looked up at the sky and sighed. An extraordinary had actually made her move so quickly. He had wanted to capture the large ape that he suspected to be a creature from the new dimension and fight for some credit. Now it seemed that Madame Dale was indeed one of the few powerhouses in the society. She was much sharper and more decisive than a middle-level cadre like him. Since she was the one who had made a move to snatch the pie, Rolf could only extinguish that thought. He quickly adjusted his position and positioned himself as a support to make up for any mistakes. He quickly found Madame Dale's number and dialed it without hesitation. Thank you for your help, Madame Dale. I believe you must have discovered the close relationship between the ape-like creature and the new dimension. Halfway through his sentence, he heard a cold snort from the other side. Rolf's heart twitched. He did not know how he had offended her. The light in the corner of his eyes changed. When he turned his head, he saw that on the distant sea surface, a bloody light was leaping. With a dazzling trajectory, it forcefully broke through the restraints of the time-stop zone and escaped into the distant sky. In the process, every inch of the trajectory of the light represented evaporation and melting damage. The amount of bloody light that flew into the clouds was reduced by at least half compared to when it was at its peak. But the reality was that the large ape, which had been defined as a weapon in hand, still forcefully passed through the temporary barrier cage in the outer sea of the volcanic island and disappeared from everyone's line of sight. Tisk, how embarrassing. Madame Dale's self-deprecating expression combined with her usual gloomy temperament made Rolf want to slap himself in the face. He did not know what to say after that. But Madame Dale herself did not end the call. Instead, she analyzed the conversation in a chatting manner. That large ape interferes in both the spiritual and material planes. The structure of its body and soul is fully mixed. It should have achieved 100% energy transformation, so its speed is beyond common sense. Ordinary barriers can't trap it. This kind of aberration creature is very rare. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. He unconsciously straightened his body. It is very rare. It suddenly appeared in the sea? Maybe it's because of the stimulation of the high-energy laser. Rolf quickly gave a brief introduction of the previous situation for reference. And just as he was speaking from the direction of Chan City, another ray of light soared into the sky and rushed over here. It was unknown which extraordinary with the ability to fly had come to join in the fun. Madame Dale snorted again. The mysterious structure that was originally suspended in the sky above the sea suddenly disappeared. The light of the volcanic island's barrier also began to fade. Perhaps this female extraordinary had already gone far away to chase after the large ape. Connie, everyone who sees this has a share. There weren't many people in Chan City who dared to directly call Madame Dale Dale. Rolf vaguely recognized the voice of Vice President Marin. Although he could not see any trace of Madame Dale Dale, Marin's traveling light was heading straight for the open sea. Clearly, the competition and pursuit had already begun. The pie flew away. Wolf subconsciously grinned. The meaning behind his smile was complicated. He subconsciously took 2 steps forward. Originally, he wanted to return to the duty room to make arrangements. However, the surging clouds and blowing rain around him were getting thicker and thicker, almost blocking the road under his feet. There was also an even more wonderful feeling of emptiness. It once again disturbed the thoughts that had previously almost disappeared. that sense of déjà vu reappeared, and it easily added the most crucial element now. Rolf's body stiffened. His memories from a few months ago flowed back. I did indeed experience this scene. Although I was on the periphery at the time, this strange feeling of the surging clouds, as if I was high in the clouds, was something I experienced half a year ago. He could confirm that President Abner, the priestess of the Order of Justice, and Old Ho, who had just eaten mustard, were in the core area at that time. The feeling of confusion caused by the surrounding rain and mist was disassembled and reassembled at this moment. The corresponding logical chain finally connected in the void. A new plane. Wasn't this the projection of a new plane? Before he could truly experience the thrill of a clear mind, the wristband flashed with yellow light again. Today was truly a day of apprehension. A subordinate in the duty room reported loudly, "Captain, there's an abnormal vibration in Area 1. Area 1? Rolf blinked. Suddenly, he shuddered again. Seclusion room, Gongqi? The ground beneath his feet suddenly trembled. In the next moment, a dazzling red light shone from the wristband. The security system exploded with the highest level of alarm. The light in the room was dim. Only the life support system's instrument lights flickered, faintly illuminating the naked human bodies in the cabin. The air temperature here was more than 10 degrees lower than the outside world. Acumen College's spring and autumn uniforms seemed a bit thin. Ruewen didn't care at all. She immersed herself in assembling. The structure she assembled was the same as the transmission array used on Northern Mountain Lake. The little girl's movements were skilled. She had practiced similar tasks countless times. The various structures of the transmission array had been maximized to the point of being modular, but clanking sounds were unavoidable when assembling. There was absolutely no lack of an automatic alarm system in this seclusion room. Soon, the special situation was reflected in the security system. But the turmoil in the outside world, especially the automatic reset of the warning system, effectively concealed the unforeseen event here. Ruewen concentrated on the work in her hands. According to Luo Nan's original plan, Ruewen had nothing to do with this territory. It was more of a gambling type of power. But now that the research and configuration were complete, the links were a bit more complicated, but the reliability was increasing. The key was the transmission array, and the safeguard was Ruewen. It's about to begin. Luo Nan's telepathic thoughts were transmitted over. At nearly the same time, a dark red glow, as thin as a thread, penetrated through the void. It fell straight onto the centermost warehouse of the quiet room. They were separated by a hair's breadth, but there were fine ripples. Chapter 787. It was quite normal for an extraordinary to set up an enchantment within the seclusion grounds. At Gongqi's level, it was impossible for anyone to completely entrust their lives to the so-called security team. This was a variable that Luo Nan could imagine, but he was powerless to do anything about. At least, this was the case before he revised his plan. The slender red beam collided with the enchantment like a high-energy laser. It scorched the barrier, but the work of breaking the barrier did not proceed smoothly. The enchantment was nearly invisible, but it was built upon the foundation of Gongqi's powerful fleshly body. It integrated with the abundant energy reserves of the seclusion area through an exquisite circulation of energy. It could be called the pinnacle of enchantment technology in the inner world. Perhaps the enchantment was limited by the way it was operated, so it could not be maintained for a long time. However, it took into consideration all sorts of unexpected situations that might occur during the period of seclusion. Its bearing capacity for the first wave of impact was quite astonishing. Its purpose was to resist the instantaneous damage of an extraordinary. The hidden structure of the incorporeal enchantment was revealed under the scorching of the slender beam of light. The precise and complex structural diagram flickered indefinitely. Its circulation was still strict, constantly digesting and transferring the impact force it was withstanding. The impact from the polar domain did not reach its upper limit, but the follow-up energy still had to bear an even more important task. If the energy was excessively consumed here, it would be very difficult to achieve the desired goal of Gongqi's tough and sturdy fleshly body. What was even worse was that the life support system had triggered the highest level of alarm the moment it received the impact. It had also activated the forced awakening mechanism. Of course, Gong Qi's soul was currently in an out-of-body state and he was imprisoned in the cloud world. He could not wake up. However, the floor beneath the cockpit had already split open. The mechanical installation drove the cockpit to rapidly sink. In the blink of an eye, the middle and lower parts of the cockpit had already sunk beneath the floor. The split opening wasted no time at all and began to close up. The life support system only needed a second and a half to sink into a permanent fortification capable of withstanding the attack of an Earth-penetrating missile. Whoosh! Rui Wen, who had been assembling the transmission array ahead, let out a sigh of relief. She stopped what she was doing and breathed out. She switched to working mode and swung her arm. It was as if an incorporeal blade slashed through the air, producing a hissing sound. The impact instantly struck the enchantment outside the cockpit. It appeared to be a sharp slash, but what it embodied was not penetrative power. When the collision occurred, the originally strict internal structure of the barrier seemed to have been replaced with a high-power engine that had been installed with an accelerator, causing it to hum and spin wildly. The situation was like a truck that was fully loaded with goods. It was moving at a steady and uniform speed, but in the blink of an eye, it had entered the territory of a sports car. Moreover, it was still accelerating, and the brake system had completely malfunctioned. Even if there was a boundless plane in front of it, the changes in the flow that exceeded the limits of what it could endure also accelerated the wear and tear of the entire system. Structural links accelerated and lost speed one after another, and the tight structure began to distort and deform until it was completely out of shape. Half a second ago, the barrier that was hard to break was like a balloon that was filled with water. With a bang, it exploded, and the scattered spiritual waves swept through the entire quiet room. It also brought with it an even sharper alarm. This secluded quiet room was completely filled with flashing red light. But no matter what, the shattering of the barrier determined the course of events. On the upper edge of the cockpit that had already sunk halfway, a small opening was silently eroded open. The fine red light drilled in through this small hole and firmly hit the forehead of Gong Qi, who was sleeping with his eyes closed inside the cockpit. Beautifully done. A praise came from the distant void. At the same time, there were indistinctly discernible howls and roars in the background. It was slightly chaotic. Rui Wen still didn't turn her head. She just quietly switched back to her work mode and continued with the finishing touches on the work at hand. As for the cockpit, the translucent nutrient fluid suddenly turned turbid. Then, a large number of air bubbles surged until it boiled. Flames. Blood-red flames ignited from between Gong Qi's eyebrows. They quickly burned through his closed eyelids, and then came out from his nostrils, mouth, and ear orifices. From point to surface, from head to toe, they covered his entire body. Under the raging blood-red flames, Gong Qi's tough body, which didn't show any signs of aging, began to distort and swell. What changed even faster was the gases in the cockpit that were exploding. The cockpit even burst open, and then the escape passage that led downwards was firmly stuck. The floor that was about to close up was also stuck there. The mechanical force and the dissimulated life force that was wreaking havoc in the cockpit clashed so powerfully that the entire floor of the room began to shake violently. Of course, this could also be due to the repeated bombardment of this area by the security team outside and the few extraordinaries who had finally come back to their senses. The seclusion quiet room hidden deep beneath the island began to collapse. The powerful mental attacks from at least 2 different extraordinaries also squeezed through the outer protective barrier, crushing inside layer by layer. The room could collapse at any moment, but Rui Wen didn't care in the slightest. She just lowered her head and used the testing apparatus Luo Nen gave her to inspect the error of the transmission array to see if it was within the permitted range. An explosive boom rang out, and the shattered parts of the cockpit sprayed out from the gaps in the floor. Without the obstruction, the 2 somewhat deformed floors finally closed together. But they only closed for half a second before the berserk power from below blasted them apart in one fell swoop. Blood-colored flames rose from the ground, illuminating the entire quiet room. They suppressed the flickering red light of the alarm. It was as if an invisible brush was sketching and smearing within the flames. Mountain ramparts, winding rivers of blood, cave temples, and so on gradually took form. Together, they constructed a treacherous picture of a lonely peak. After this picture of a lonely peak, the outline of a human body gradually became clear. It seemed to have condensed into some sort of liquid substance. It warped endlessly, gradually taking shape. The island structure that the quiet room was built on began to collapse at an accelerated rate. And the existence within the bloody flames that seemed human yet inhuman walked over in Ruewen's direction with heavy footsteps. Ruewen remained unresponsive. The flaming humanoid brushed past Ruewen's body. It walked all the way to the metal chest that she had brought with her before, the chest that had already been mostly dismantled. There was still a set of mechanical components that Ruewen had not touched within the chest. As the flaming humanoid drew closer, the drifting tail of flames swept across the metal chest outside. High heat was transmitted over, and what burst out from the chest was a deep blue electric flame. The glow of the barrier of the volcanic island had just dimmed, but it shone once more. This time, the deep blue color of the barrier had turned quite a bit deeper. It was suffused with a purplish-red luster. Warped runes revolved within each large grape, and they passed through the internal pipes to transmit a majestic power to the location of Area 1. The barrier of that area clearly could not withstand this power. Just as it was about to collapse, it was forcefully controlled by Madame de Lay. The structure of the barrier suddenly changed from defending against external forces to suppressing and sealing inward. This was Madame de Lay's habitual method, but the other spiritual type extraordinary who stood across from her was Canon Monroe, who was famous for his long-range firepower. He was clearly not pleasing to the eye. "You've covered this place so tightly that I can't even use my hands and feet." Hiss, there's a conflict between our soul forces again. "You're disturbing me." Ever since the rise of the cage theory, a certain genius youth's theory of assault had also become widespread. An old hand like Monroe loved this sort of joke the most. From time to time, he would play around with it. Using it on a strong person of the opposite sex at the same level gave him an exceptional sense of accomplishment. Madame de Lay always wore a thick robe that covered her body and a hood that covered her head. She looked like a mysterious witch from the Middle Ages. She couldn't be bothered to bicker with the old bastard Monroe, nor would she change her most habitual way of doing things. She turned a deaf ear to Monroe's protests. Moreover, they had already wasted too much time. Above the two spiritual type extraordinary, Vice President Marin's brows were tightly furrowed. He was rather anxious in his heart. Abner was away, and as the first vice president he was the one in charge. If something were to happen, it would be a great loss of face. This was a bad omen. Marin was a pure physical extraordinary. Mental senses weren't his forte, but his spiritual senses were sharp and his intuition was astonishing. He instinctively felt that the situation in Area 1 and Gongchi's situation were very bad. However, that old fellow had always been untrustworthy. He had set up too many defensive measures in his seclusion room, and now they had all become fatal obstacles. But these defensive measures were all intact, so where did the danger inside come from? "I'll go in." Impatience finally wore away the last bit of Marin's patience. It also burned away the arrogance of his status. His figure sank down. He wanted to use the most direct and skilled method to directly penetrate the barrier and figure out the problem inside. As for whether or not Gongchi would have any objections after this, he would wait until he had a future to think about it. Marin's thoughts were clear. His tyrannical body propelled an inconceivable force, and he crashed down like a meteorite falling from the sky. Even Madame de Lay, who controlled the barrier, had to make way for him. But the moment his body passed through the barrier, Marin's rapidly descending body suddenly came to a halt. The two spiritual type extraordinaries in midair also reacted at the same time. All three of them stopped what they were doing and turned their heads to look at the sky. In the gaps between the gloomy and heavy clouds above the volcanic island, dark blue waves of light suddenly flashed and leaped. The surrounding clouds seemed to have turned into a strange lantern. Intense light flickered inside and leaped about. In the end, it tore apart the fragile outer skin and sprayed out dazzling electric flames. And in the eyes of the three extraordinary, when the electric flames tore apart the clouds, there was a powerful force field that shouldn't have appeared. It tore apart the barrier between the abyss area and the material world at the same time, allowing the spiritual and material planes to fully interfere. Moreover, it set up an invisible guideway that locked onto the target of the berserk energy. Rumble! The sound of thunder came from the horizon, and the rapidly expanding air stirred restlessly in the void. But what spread at a speed thousands of times faster than this powerful vibration were the three electric spears that shot down from the clouds. Chapter 788. At this moment, the situation on the physical plane on Volcano Island was soul-stirring. However, on the corresponding abyssal zone, the possibility of most spectators being spectators was immediately eliminated. At present, the abyssal zone had completely turned into a destructive windstorm. The collision of the transcendent level forces and the explosion of each force affected the magnificent power of the torrents in the abyss zone. Impact and recoil, control and loss of control. Under the high-speed confrontation on the mental plane, under the pressure of a powerful opponent, even extraordinaires could not take care of every detail. As a result, the level of chaos continued to increase. The accumulated violent power swept from top to bottom, sweeping through every level that people could reach with their thoughts. Even a veteran B-rank powerhouse like Rolf could not recover from the impact of the lightning spear. He was so shocked by the surrounding void that it was as fragile as thin paper that he found it hard to breathe. He was afraid that a moment of carelessness would cause the barrier to break and the abyssal zone's torrent to flood out, wiping out the entire security team. Rolf was already like this. As a participant in the battle, the pressure was even more astonishing. The high-level attack and defense of the abyssal zone needed to draw out a relatively clear vein in the deep chaos that continued to increase. With great control, the direction of the battle would not be greatly deviated. The problem was that Madame de Lay and the others had made a mistake in their judgment from the beginning. The lightning spear that had been thrown down seemed to be an explosive attack. It was indeed so at the beginning, but only when it was truly received did it reveal the exquisite structure and operation mode hidden deep within the abyssal zone. That was the continuous lashing of the long whip and the iron chain. The enormous power from the abyss, under the effect of the extremely efficient mode, came and went one after another. The bright light and the dark thunder were almost endless, not giving them any chance to catch their breath. The best way, and also the only way to deal with it, was to endure this round of impact and then plan again. Of course, the three extraordinaires were not really suppressed to the point that they could not breathe. Malin, who was not good at psychic sensing, could still give orders. Electromagnetic ability, what's the situation below? The two spiritual-type extraordinaires had already sent their thoughts into the seclusion area. They intertwined and swept through the area, and they also found something. Madame de Lay said, "The palace life support cabin is broken, and the remains are missing." Monroe followed closely. "That guy is equipped with an exoskeleton armor and is hiding his head and tail. Furthermore, he managed to conceal his aura. It seems like he was setting fire earlier." The form of the burning seems to be somewhat familiar. According to the cage theory, the current situation was more or less a situation where the two parties were attacking each other at the same time. Everyone could take part of the initiative, but no one could seize more opportunities to win. Of course, Marlin and the other two were on the same side, but to effectively work together in the abyssal zone storm that had erupted in an instant, they still needed to constantly adjust. The problem was that the other party was also constantly changing. It wasn't the kind of inevitable trend towards chaos, but rather a subtle reverse effect. Strange. Luo couldn't help but add. In the process of colliding and bombarding each other, the chaos in the abyss area would increase exponentially every second. Hundreds and thousands of variables would appear every second. They were huge in number and lacked connection, thus bringing about greater interference. Of course, the combatants had to do their best to eliminate the interference. The problem was that the strong control of soul power would cause the other side to become even stronger while suppressing a portion of the changes. After all, power was always interacting with each other, and no one could completely transcend the abyss and exist independently. Everyone could only evaluate and calculate based on experience. It would be too flattering to say that it was calculation. Most of the time, it was still using experience, half-guessing and half-guessing. In this way, combatants like Men Luo, while the stirring power was getting stronger and stronger, their control basically showed a smooth downward trend. The power of extraordinaries was reflected in the word smooth. If it were anyone else, their control would only fall precipitously. This was the reason why certain rank B spiritual type attacks and defenses in the abyss area were often 3-second men. What made Men Luo feel strange was that the other party's operating efficiency in the abyss area didn't decrease after every round of explosive increase in variables. Instead, it increased. At first, Men Luo, including Madame de Lay and Marlin, thought that the other party was doing a vicious cycle of forceful reinforcement, so they waited for the other side to run out of power before counterattacking. But now, they finally realized that the other party wasn't increasing in power, but in efficiency. In the chaos of exponential growth, the efficiency of power integration was constantly increasing, and the rate of improvement was getting faster and faster. The extent of accumulation was also getting more and more obvious. T. The consequence of a wrong judgment was that they had missed the other party's rhythm. In other words, they had completely lost the initiative. Counterattack. Marlin growled. In the attack and defense of the abyss area, his physical side was relatively marginalized, but it was also easy to adjust. As a physical side, he had to be aware of it. He didn't hesitate to take damage and act as a sharp knife to counterattack, forcefully interrupting the other party's strange rhythm. Under the impetus of Marlin's powerful will, which was almost tangible, his physical body's blood energy was forcibly increased, and with a burning posture, he achieved the resonance of the body and soul structure, interfering with the spiritual plane. Based on the foundation of stable matter, the blood energy was like a flying mountain, forcibly suppressing the almost irreversible chaotic situation in the abyss area. This kind of momentum couldn't last long, but it had the power to turn the situation around with a surprise attack. At least, that was what Madame de Lay and Men Luo thought. They also used the momentum to counterattack. However, the other party retreated. That's right, they retreated. When Marin had forcefully interrupted them and de Lay and Monroe were about to counterattack, the thunderbolts and lightning bolts had all retreated. Moreover, it separated from Marlin and the other two at the same time. At the same time, 3 extraordinaries, 3 different ability natures and rhythms. The difference in separation was simply measured in microseconds. It was precisely because of this precise uniformity that they didn't have the chance to stick together again. They left as soon as they said they would, and the abyss area's reaction instantly turned to 0. This is impossible. Men Luo cried out involuntarily. He had always been known as a long-range firepower on the spiritual plane. He was powerful, but he was lacking in exquisiteness. The instantaneous difference he felt was also the most obvious. In the abyss area's chaotic environment, this kind of observation and the corresponding exquisite microcontrol technique had already exceeded the limits of his common sense. How did he do it? Marlin was stunned for half a second. Compared to the opponent's microsecond level of error, using his units to calculate the magnitude, the difference was basically equivalent to the passage of a week. After a week, Marlin's face flushed red. He changed the direction of his heavy punch and bombarded the island below. The upper structure of Gong Chi's isolation room collapsed in one fell swoop. The situation was the same as in the abyss area. There was no longer any resistance here, and there was no trace of the so-called Deep Blue Walker either. There was only the collapsed structure's wreckage mixed in with the mud powder and stones. Marlin stepped into the ruins. There were traces of the structure of space-time trembling here. There was also the smell of high-temperature baking mixed in with the smell of ionization in the air. The traces left behind were not few, but abundant enough to make one's brain explode. Vice President, the volcanic island's new plane, The mist illusion has disappeared. It seems like it happened before the lightning strike. Wolf, who was at the periphery, finally had the opportunity to come over and report. Marlin's face twitched. If anyone dared to say that the so-called new plane was a natural phenomenon that wasn't man-made, he would spit on that fellow's face right now. Chapter 789. Who in the world are you? A berserk thought swept out. Within the misty labyrinth, the sand painting that was temporarily pieced together by millions and millions of domain fragments soundlessly shattered. The previous scene stopped in the bloody light of raging flames. The human body warped and expanded until the moment it completely deformed and melted. The things that followed didn't have much meaning for Gongqi. He just knew that his fleshly body had reached the level depicted in the scene. It was already an irreversible destruction. Gongqi was still unwilling to believe the truth presented in the scene. He found it even harder to believe that his terrible situation was single-handedly created by an underage youth like Luo Nan. In a short amount of time, his thoughts cleaved apart the surrounding rolling and whistling dust storm countless times. He wanted to obtain a clear answer to support the absurd and terrifying logic of the scene. But there was no response from start to finish. He knew that such a state of mind was terrible. He tried to control it, but the changes in the situation from another space and time, as well as the deeper feedback from the abyss region and the solidified configuration, made his calm and steady mind, which he had always been proud of, tremble and crack at the deepest level. He found it hard to restrain himself. Anyone who saw their own fleshly body liquefy and evaporate in the flames, turning into nourishing fertilizer for the other species, while their soul body in another space and time suddenly became a lonely ghost, would probably have this kind of feeling. At the same time, Gongqi also had to bear the impact of the solidified configuration in the abyss region of Earth. This was equivalent to the rupture of his cultivation foundation. His soul body flickered indeterminately. His aura repeatedly fluctuated. This was much more accurate than the opponent's flashy sand painting. Gongqi wasn't an ordinary person by now. Snake Tongue had never seen Gongqi like this before. Of course, what happened on Chan City's holy land of cultivation, Volcanic Island, far exceeded her imagination. Right now, Gongqi still had the curtain of his extraordinary domain. He still possessed the strength of an extraordinary. However, Snake Tongue felt that the extraordinary soul body in front of her was unprecedentedly ethereal. It was like a vicious and ugly demon. It was unknown when it would melt under the sunlight. Snake Tongue's shock and fear towards Luo Nan, who had created all of this, was even greater than Gongqi's. She was also affected by the previous events. She was wrapped in absurd delight. These complex emotions pieced together Luo Nan's image in her mind once more. But even she knew that there were far too many subjective things stuffed into it. Layers upon layers of distortion and rendering. He was like an evil demon god, invading her already limited thinking bandwidth. Maybe this is another nightmare? Of course, it was leaked by Gongqi. Perhaps Gongqi sensed Snake Tongue's attention, but he suddenly turned his head. His actions were completely human, and they were displayed by his spirit body. It was even more ironic at this time. Gongqi himself sensed it as well, and his gaze changed to become unprecedentedly savage and terrifying. He no longer needed to conceal anything. He directly extended his hand and grabbed Snake Tongue, who was wrapped in the veil of silence. She didn't have the slightest ability to resist. However, Snake Tongue suddenly had a marvelous feeling when she faced Gongqi like this. Her thoughts circulated, but they didn't take form. Instead, they were nimble like she hadn't been in a long time. Even though she was mocking herself, she said, "I almost forgot. I'm about to die. Dying from anger is perhaps the most worthless way to die." Gongqi's spirit body abruptly underwent another wave of bright and dark changes, reflecting his seriously unstable emotions. Amidst the radiating psychic waves, Snake Tongue thought that her time was up. But in reality, the powerful pressure transmitted by the veil of silence retreated. "You're right, we can't waste it." Gong Qi's thoughts were heavy as he suppressed his emotions, and he was like a volcano that was in an unstable state. But his control had returned, and it was still slowly increasing. He operated the curtain of extraordinary domain and did a few rounds of searching, but he still didn't find any trace of Luo Nan. He didn't get a reply either. After another round of failed attempts, he suddenly asked, "What do you think Luo Nan is doing?" "He's probably watching you make a fool of yourself." Snake Tongue completely let loose. She mocked him without the slightest bit of mercy. Gong Qi actually didn't get angry. He even discussed with a deadpan expression, "No, he's more likely dealing with some trouble. He and his accomplices destroyed my fleshly body, but that place is a volcanic island reef. It's a closed-door area. There are 3 to 5 extraordinaries there all year round. No matter how outstanding their previous infiltration was, it was impossible for them to escape unscathed after triggering the security system. It's precisely because a large amount of energy was involved there that he missed an opportunity to deal a fatal blow." Gong Qi's thoughts couldn't be said to be wrong, but what logic was behind the neat and tidy logic of his thoughts? For a time, Snake Tongue couldn't find the right words to describe this feeling. She just felt awkward and weird. He missed an opportunity. That's my opportunity. Gong Qi was still analyzing. His thoughts leaped back and forth. I've already leaped into the extraordinary realm. My soul body is indestructible. So what if my foundation is damaged? There are many ways to make up for it in this world. He still can't do anything to me. He doesn't possess the ability to kill me, and he's missed opportunities again and again. When I first fell into the domain fragment trap, when my fleshly body was destroyed. That's right. If I miss an opportunity, I'll be punished. My opportunity has come. Snake Tongue asked, "What opportunity?" Gong Qi let out a low chuckle. He didn't answer. The extraordinary domain curtain that rose up around his body clearly contracted and rolled back. Then he escaped. Snake Tongue was truly stunned. She was under Gong Qi's control. She was unable to probe the changes in the external environment. She only knew that Gong Qi's speed was very fast. It didn't matter if his laws were chaotic within the sandstorm of the domain fragment. He just needed to use his own laws to temporarily replace and integrate them. The superiority of extraordinaries was displayed to the point of brilliance. The problem was that no matter how brilliant Gong Qi's flying techniques were, he was unable to change the nature of his actions. He ran away. He took advantage of Luo Nan's lack of attention to escape. He even ran away immensely proud of himself. Fine, he looked a bit excited. This kind of emotional bottom line was continuously exposed from his constant mental communication. Luo Nan destroyed my fleshly body. He ruined my foundation. He even transmitted the events that occurred in Earth's space-time to me in real time. I know what he wants to do. He wants to crush my will, to destroy my spirit, to make me collapse without a fight. But his thinking is too simple. His live streaming was a major failure. He made this damned place establish a new connection with Earth's space-time. The first reason was that you were tricked by him into becoming one with your body. The second reason was the backlash caused by the collapse of my foundation in the Abyss region. Adding in the live streaming, there are so many formulas. Why would I be afraid of not being able to solve the equations? Hearing Gong Qi's confident tone, Snake Tongue was skeptical. You solved it? I want to collect even more formulas. Gong Qi answered as if it was a matter of course. Luo Nan's biggest mistake was to treat this place as a trap. But this place isn't a warped cloud. Instead, it's a foundation and hub. Most importantly, it isn't monotonous at all. It's changing. As long as it's changing, there are rules that can be dug out. No matter how Snake Tongue viewed him, Gong Qi believed that he had already recovered from the blow of having his body destroyed. Moreover, he had entered an extraordinary state under the pressure and stimulation. His powers of observation were sharper. His train of thought was clearer. He discovered many hidden details and veins within the dust, mist, and sandstorm. Countless domain fragments were piled together within this misty labyrinth. At first glance, everything looked the same from every direction, but the details were different. There were large and small fragments. There were clear differences in the types and characteristics of their structures, as well as in the way they were distributed. They were completely different from the circulation of cloud energy in the clouds. People got lost here. On one hand, the laws were chaotic in this dangerous place. On the other hand, far too many disparate elements appeared in one's mind. It was the polar opposite of the cloud world. What's interesting is that the two are closely related. It's not just that one is on the outside and one is on the inside, one is on the inside and one is on the outside. It's because they both have suns. Suns? That's right. The suns that appear in the polar domain really do have an influence that reaches far and wide. We can see them in the clouds, but we can't see them here. However, there's a temperature that belongs to them. Gong Qi's spirit body revealed a lively smile. Do you remember? I once said that behind these domain fragments, there was bound to be an even more fundamental space-time frame. Perhaps this is it. In the depths of the layered domain fragments, perhaps that sun is the core of the space-time frame. It affects the operation of the dust, mist, and sandstorm, the fourth formula. When solving an equation under a limited number of unknowns, the more relevant and meaningful formulas there were, the easier it would be to find the answer. Gong Qi had this feeling, and it was becoming more and more intense. He began to make a hypothesis. If I take this sun hidden in the depths of the domain fragments and treat it as a fixed number, I can simplify the problem and do some calculations. Gong Qi took the initiative to stop his explanation and put a large amount of energy into his calculation work. His flying speed became slower and slower until he gradually came to a stop. This old thing seemed to really have a harvest. Just as Snake Tongue was pondering, an unforeseen event occurred. The whistling tremors of the dust storm in the outside world suddenly intensified. It was also in this instant that the previously turbulent environment, which could barely be considered safe, was stripped clean. The veil of silence was pulled away. If time was rewound 2 hours ago, perhaps Snake Tongue would be looking forward to this result even in her dreams. But now, after a series of unforeseen events, Snake Tongue's extremely weak spirit body core had already lost the ability to exist independently. As soon as it was exposed to the impact of the dust storm, it showed signs of disintegration. A tenth of a second later, Gong Qi used his aura to wrap around her, temporarily saving her life. However, this action was brimming with ominous intentions. She only heard Gong Qi say, "I've already unraveled your formula. Your value? Yes, I can still make use of it one last time." Snake Tongue didn't have time to react. She didn't have the opportunity to curse or express her hatred. Gong Qi flicked his finger, and the spirit body core wrapped in his aura was forcefully thrown into the dust storm. It quickly went far away. Chapter 790. Her final value was embodied here? Snake Tongue felt that it was absurd, but she also felt calm, as if she had finally reached her destination. Things had developed to this point, far exceeding the upper limit of her usefulness. Her repeated struggles had only resulted in this. Just like that, she was wrapped in a sandstorm of dust. It was as if she was in the turbulent flow of fate. She drifted with the waves until she reached the top. But in reality, her fate had been controlled by someone else from beginning to end. The temporary protective cover set up by Gong Qi determined the length of the final part of her life. The protective cover was firm. Even under the assault of the chaotic domain fragments of the laws, it was only slowly worn away. It was to buy as much time as possible for Gong Qi to escape. At the same time, it was sensitive. It was closely linked to Snake Tongue's soul structure. When the protective cover shattered, Snake Tongue would inevitably be destroyed along with it. Gong Qi was certain that there was an unknown connection between Snake Tongue and Luo Nan. Therefore, he used Snake Tongue to mislead Luo Nan's tracking direction. Of course, Luo Nan might not fall for it, but as long as he hesitated for a moment, a bit more time would be good. Snake Tongue saw through Gong Qi's scheme, but it didn't matter. She just waited quietly like this. The legendary memories and repentance before her death never appeared. She had long since weakened to the point where she couldn't even bear her memories. Her thoughts and emotions flowed without limit. Even Snake Tongue herself didn't know what her thoughts and state of mind would be in the next moment. She believed that her candle-like life was about to disappear without a trace in this state. But at this time, Luo Nan's face inexplicably appeared in the lake of her heart. The relief sculpture of a human face pieced together by domain fragments, under the influence of her chaotic thoughts and emotions, transformed into a demonic god burning amidst the boundless space and time. The demonic god possessed a malevolent and sinister body, a lustrous and dazzling color. But in the end, all the elements settled in the pair of deep eyes that had never changed from beginning to end. They slowly became clear. Snake Tongue didn't know why she would allow this face to completely occupy her mind in the final moments of her life. Perhaps she had even unwittingly given away this little bit of autonomy. Snake Tongue gave up on everything. She allowed time to wrap around her as she indifferently advanced. She followed the most fundamental laws of the universe, gradually changing from order to disorder. The protective barrier began to disintegrate. The structure of the spirit body was also implicated, collapsing from the very foundation. Perhaps if time flowed a bit more, then the medium known as Snake Tongue would completely disintegrate from the material world and perish. But under these circumstances, Luo Nan, the demonic god that coiled and converged at the bottom of her heart, still existed. He existed steadily, not shifting from any change. Is it not a creation of my mind? Wouldn't it rot? It exists independently of me? Or could it be that at this moment, when I'm about to collapse and perish, there's still a corner of my consciousness that's supporting me? Luo Nan, no, that demonic god, has been paying attention to me from beginning to end. Has he used a portion of his power on my side? If that was the case, do I still have a chance? There was still a chance of survival? Snake Tongue's already stagnant train of thought seemed to have come alive. It was like a candle that had already burned out, a spark in the ashes of a fire, struggling to not be extinguished. It was because of the endless desire for life that was hidden deep in the embers and had never been completely eliminated. At this moment, Snake Tongue suddenly understood. In the end, she was unwilling. She still wanted to live. She wanted to live. She wasn't willing to give up even the slightest possibility, the slightest trace of hope. She was already unable to rely on her own strength to continue living. Then she would plead and beg. Even if it was lowly and ugly, it was fine as long as she lived. Therefore, her will that was on the verge of collapse burned in this way. Save me. My lord, I beg you to save me. I'm willing to give up everything. Everything. I'm willing to endure everything. Everything. I just ask to be entrusted in your shadow. I want to have a place to kneel and worship under your feet. I only have this humble request. I worship you as the ruler of life. I will listen to your judgment. Save me. Save me. The protective barrier silently collapsed, and the chaotic power of the sandstorms seeped in. The structure of her spirit body was like a sandcastle under the tide. It changed beyond recognition in an instant. Snake Tongue didn't have the strength to resist. Her consciousness suddenly dimmed. But in this instant of annihilation, the last clear thought that remained was, "Save me." This thought flickered, trembled, rose, and fell. It could be extinguished at any moment. But in the end, it still survived. Moreover, it really did connect with fuel. It recovered its brightness little by little. Snake Tongue woke up. Her soul fire supported her consciousness. Little by little, she recovered the fragments of her memories and pieced them together to form a vein of thought. Then she discovered that she was currently attached to a thin thread that was hard to distinguish between real and fake. She was hanging alone in the nothingness. Soon, bright and scorching rays of light spilled down, drawing her in to look up. Above her was a dense interweaving, three-dimensional and complex network. It was like a spider web, but it was hundreds of times more complicated. And at the core of the spider web was a blazing sun. It was so dazzling that it was hard to look directly at it. Even the red light that was spitting out from the edges covered the entire spider web structure. At this moment, The thin thread that was attached to Snake Tongue was hanging down from the spider web structure. It was directly connected to the spider web and pulled her closer and closer to the spider web. During this process, the sound of crashing could be heard without end. Some were extremely far away, coming from the upper core of the spider web structure. Some were extremely close, belonging to the thin thread that pulled her in. This thin thread was an exquisite and tough chain. It directly penetrated her mind, firmly locking her down without leaving any leeway. As a curse master of orthodox origins in the shrine, Snake Tongue quickly understood. Her mind was submerged in an extremely symbolic space of consciousness. She clearly understood where she belonged, and she experienced the fundamental restraints and corresponding status she received from the demon god Luo Nan's system. In other words, she was still here. She was still alive. Snake Tongue laughed loudly. She didn't care about the chains binding her mind. She didn't care about the spider web and the sun that grew closer and closer. She didn't care about the unpredictable fate that awaited her. She just indulged herself, laughing happily in this space of consciousness. Her surging emotions were burning. But right now, she had the qualifications. She had the capital. She could wantonly waste and vent her emotions unless the demon god that controlled her life ordered her to stop. Luo Nan didn't stop her, and Snake Tongue was finally done laughing. She got closer and closer to the sun web. The closer she got, the more complex and precise the structure of the spider web she could see. The number of connected nodes increased. She had felt lonely before because she was in the outermost region. She was far from the center. In fact, there was another chain hanging down from the spider web in this outermost region aside from the thread she was at. It just so happened to intersect with her thread and cast into the depths of the void. It was unknown where or who it was connected to. Chapter 791. Gong Qi moved at high speed amidst the dust and sandstorm. He didn't stop to rest for over 10 hours. He needed to use his extraordinary domain to integrate the chaotic and collapsing fragments of his domain. He needed to open up a path in the void where there was no path. He also needed to endure the destruction of his fleshly body and the damage to his foundation, which brought chaos and disturbance to his extraordinary domain. This undoubtedly increased his consumption, whether it was in terms of energy or mental strength. But Gong Qi gradually calmed down as time passed. Luo Nan had yet to catch up to him. Gong Qi had most likely thrown him off. Perhaps it was temporary, but he used this time to stabilize the negative effects of his fleshly body to the greatest degree. His combat strength had rebounded compared to the fiercest initial assault. He should be able to reach 60 to 70% of his peak. 60 to 70% of extraordinaries were still extraordinaries. Gong Qi was confident that he could deal with the vast majority of unforeseen events. Moreover, the Guardian on Volcano Island is enough to give Luo Nan and the power behind him a hard time. That old fox Abner should be able to mend the pen after the sheep is lost as long as he puts in a bit of effort. Gong Qi thought about many things in the span of over 10 hours. The changes in the situation on Earth were only a very small part of it. He spent most of his time and energy exploring and verifying the misty labyrinth environment. Moreover, he had more and more ideas. My initial judgment was correct, and there are no problems with the direction of my calculations. This shattered space has a close interference relationship with Earth's spacetime. The cloud world outside is very likely the product of this interference. Therefore, it possesses environmental conditions similar to Earth, but it is distorted and absurd. It seems boundless, but it is actually just a monotonous cycle of the structure of spacetime. Gong Qi also understood that there were still many unsolved mysteries within the cloud world. For example, the blood-colored monster apes that shuttled back and forth were already complete living bodies. Where they came from and where they belonged was completely unknown. But he wasn't a space-time research expert. He wasn't a distortion scholar. He didn't rely on this to make a living. He just wanted to return to Earth's space-time to deal with the chaotic situation. He only had this goal and nothing more. Once he caught his breath, he would uproot Luo Nan and the power behind him. He would even uproot the Xia City branch. Moreover, he would use the most vicious methods on Luo Nan's body. He would use them on all of Luo Nan's friends and family. He would let that little bastard truly experience what despair and regret were. Gong Qi showed signs of letting go of his thoughts and emotions. He suppressed them with great difficulty and comforted himself. The 4 clues and 4 formulas that he had found in succession were enough to express the interference relationship between the 2 spacetime on different levels. It was from these 4 formulas that he deduced that he discovered more clues and made a series of basic judgments. The structure of the interference between the 2 spaces was rather complicated. There could be 2 or 3 core interference zones, and they could change at any time. In other words, the 2 spaces were in a state of activity relative to each other. Sometimes they were more closely connected, and sometimes they were separated. The easiest way to return to Earth was, of course, to find the core interference zone and destroy the relatively fragile barrier there. But it was not absolute. As long as he could control the basic structure of the interference, it was fine to be a little more on the periphery. It wasn't easy to identify 2 or 3 core interference zones. The 2 spacetime interference points were definitely not in a one-to-one correspondence. The slightest difference could make a huge difference. Comparatively speaking, the misty labyrinth was easier to deal with. After all, it was more intuitive, and he could observe how the domain fragments worked together. He would be able to find some clues. On the other hand, the spacetime of Earth was separated by a layer. There was no way to sense it. It was impossible to rely purely on calculations. Gong Qi's train of thought was quite open. He used some information outside of technology to make up for it. His train of thought was like this: did Luo Nan, a teenager, really have the ability to blaze a different path? The possibility of him inheriting the legacy of his elders was greater. He had studied Luo Nan's information before. Although it was relatively superficial, he still knew about Luo Nan's grandfather and father's research back in the wilderness. The information displayed the direction of their research and the main areas of activity. There was no need to talk about Xia City. There were also a few plateaus in the border region of the Eurasian Plate and the Indian Ocean Plate. The area around Spring City was the longest. Gong Qi first placed Xia City's priority on the back burner. He still did not know what role Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong played in this matter. Even though he was certain that Luo Nan was a protective puppy who did not report the matter of the Cloud World to the Xia City branch, he did not dare to gamble. After all, the resources that Luo Nan displayed far exceeded the upper limit that a young man should have. What if the Xia City branch really did participate? They would simply be surrounded and killed if they returned from there. Comparatively speaking, Spring City was the best entry point. If this interference zone truly existed. No, it certainly existed. Gong Qi had already circled back and forth in a designated suspicious area for 4 or 5 hours. The more he circled, the more excited he became. He felt that he was already very close. This was not an illusory feeling. This was real evidence. He raised his hand, and the bead of light wrapped in his aura floated up. It was similar to how he took care of Snake Tongue, but this time he was even more careful. There was a fragment within the bead of light. It was not something as high and mighty as a domain fragment. Instead, it had something similar to an insect's appendage. Fine, it was not similar. It was an insect's appendage. This was his greatest harvest after coming to this area. 5 hours ago, when Gong Qi discovered this toy, it was much more complete than it was now. At the very least, he could see what its true form looked like. Gong Qi was confident that he would be the first to capture this little toy as soon as it floated past his sensing range. He would absolutely not miss it. The radiance of his spiritual body suddenly rippled. It seemed to resonate with the fine spatial ripples at the edge of his sensing range. Gong Qi quickly suppressed the throbbing in his heart. He stared closely at that area and silently covered it up. The operation of the dust storm in that area was slightly affected. A portion of the domain fragment lost speed and collided with the other fragments in the surroundings. Some bounced off each other, while others were stimulated to emit annihilating electric flames. Little by little, they accumulated and blossomed into an expanse of bright light in the void. The light quickly disappeared, but it annihilated the foreign species that had rushed in earlier into that area into ashes. But a mere second later, new foreign species crawled out from the fine spatial ripples. In the blink of an eye, they were engulfed by the sandstorm and involuntarily flung away. What awaited them was undoubtedly a destructive fate. But in this instant, Gongqi had already approached quickly enough to determine the appearance, species, and origins of these little foreign species. Ants. Ant-like life forms. They were red and lustrous like blood and fire. Just based on their ability to struggle in this shattered space and the dust storm, it proved that they were no ordinary insects. There was a high probability that they belonged to a mutant species. Mutant species, ants, blood. The most famous of them all was naturally the fire god ant. That's right, it was the Spring City area's specialty, the fire god ant. Chapter 792. In the fine ripples, groups of Vulcan ants emerged one after another, and they were annihilated again and again. There were at least a few dozen groups of thousands of them, and only one or two lucky ones, like the evidence Gongqi had captured before, escaped the interference zone of the domain fragments and the fine ripples of spacetime. They came out in one piece, but in the blink of an eye, they were swept away by the howling sandstorm and crushed in another form. Their actions were like moths flying into a flame. He had no idea what was going on. Gongqi observed carefully, forcing himself to calm down. It took a great deal of willpower for him to hold back from rushing over at the first moment. But his mind kept turning. If even ants can pass through the interference point, there's no reason I can't pass through it. Alright, I need to calm down. Maybe it's just a tiny point. I need to widen it. What's on the other end of the interference point? He needed to investigate further. Actually, he could guess it. It was most likely a magma space. In recent years, research on Vulcan ants had been a very popular field. This kind of social aberrant population, aberrant nests that could be cultivated, and the mental level that could be raised through collective consciousness. There were too many things to ponder. Gongqi searched his memory for relevant research papers, hoping to find more clues and verification from the habits of Vulcan ants. The problem was that no research had ever mentioned that Vulcan ants could actually penetrate the space-time barrier, reach a shattered space, and come in waves to die. For an aberrant population with strict social ethics, what was the meaning of such behavior? Most importantly, would it affect Gongqi, who was in a hurry to return to Earth's space-time? Just as he was pondering, the position of the space-time interference point finally changed a little after thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated. The source of the change was the remains of the Vulcan ants' shells. In terms of size, the Vulcan ant was considered rather large among the ant species. The different variants produced by each nest had an average length of 1-2 centimeters. The largest was even nearly 5 centimeters in size. But from a human's perspective, it was still not considered much, not to mention compared to the vast and boundless misty maze. However, when thousands of similar gadgets surged out in a short period of time and piled up the corpses, the adjectives such as tiny were no longer suitable. Although their bodies could not resist the erosion of the sandstorm, they turned the unfavorable situation bit by bit in an even more incredible way. When the crushed remains were piled up to a certain extent, Gongqi actually felt a very obvious magic. Due to the piling up of these corpses, the fine ripples in the void became somewhat chaotic. However, the indistinct space-time gap of the interference point was not affected. Instead, it expanded and stabilized. These fire god ants seemed to be using their own corpses to fill the trench. Their tiny shells carried amazing energy. Even if they were shattered, the energy would still remain. Also, under the effective effect of the group consciousness, they were reassembled and built a bridgehead on the interference point of space and time. Although it was not yet completed, the prototype could already be seen. As long as there were no more major disturbances in the misty labyrinth, and the fire god ant colony had an endless supply of backup forces, it would most likely be completed. The mutant species were indeed peculiar and extraordinary. The material attributes of the individual and the mental level of the group were extremely efficient in integrating together. This was how they achieved such an astonishing result. This group of first-hand materials that could drive a mutant ecologist crazy was a small matter. What was truly decisive was the endlessly expanding and stabilizing narrow passageway that clearly connected Earth's space-time with the misty labyrinth. Whether it was calculations or senses, they all verified the authenticity of the passageway. The heavens have not forsaken me. Gong Qi really could not hold it in any longer. The path of survival was within reach, but it had already consumed most of his mental strength. The bridgehead formed by piling up the corpses of the fire god ants was becoming more and more obvious. Its defense and interference rules were becoming more and more unyielding. While it was helping him resolve his problems, he could not help but worry. If this continued, it was hard to say what sort of situation the fire god ant colony would stir up. In the off chance it affected the space-time structure of the interference point, it would result in the consequence of making a mistake of 1,000 miles. He could only ram his head into a wall. The fire god ant's strange and illogical behavior and the natural space of lava on the other side were completely unrelated to humans no matter how he looked at it. It had nothing to do with Luo Nan, who he feared the most. All he needed to do now was to return to Earth's space-time and bypass the threats of Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong. The sky was high and the sea was wide. Nothing could stop him. Go, go, go. When Gong Qi's mind was set, the yarn of silence displayed its miraculous effect. Gong Qi's spiritual body truly seemed to become a thin mist of nothingness under the wrapping of this strange item. His powerful extraordinary level power was hidden in formlessness. He was able to go against the flow of the narrow passageway constructed by the fire god ants. He intersected with the fire god ant colony that surged out, and he also made close contact with their group consciousness. He brushed past them. He was truly close to the fire god ant colony, and his senses were even more exquisite. This group of little things, whether they were alive or dead, did indeed have their own rules. The mental power formed by the group consciousness was both a commander and a glue. It dominated the entirety of the colony and each individual from life to death. If he were to substitute himself as an individual in this society, then it would truly be so tight that it would suffocate him. But if he were to observe it from a detached perspective, there was no lack of errors and omissions formed by low-level instincts. And this was the most natural state. It was precisely because of this that Gong Qi eliminated the risk and came over with peace of mind. However, he also carefully avoided disturbing them, afraid that something unexpected would happen. The space-time rift was a highly distorted structure. It was very difficult to quantify it with something like length. Gong Qi had to conform to the rules and regulations of the fire god ants, which took a lot of time. But when he truly moved out, he still deeply felt that all the hard work was worth it. The chaotic misty maze and the monotonous cloud world were completely left behind. What replaced them were more diverse and orderly structures and colors. In the hollow underground cavern, dark red lava gurgled, illuminating the surrounding cavern walls. It also illuminated the huge ant nest that was half trapped inside. Dark black and dark red were the main colors, mixed with the bluish-gray pieces of the rock. The state of interweaving light and shadow was filled with natural liveliness and charm. I'm back, I'm back! Gong Qi burst into laughter. His laughter surged in the underground lava area, stirring up waves. At this time, he was no longer afraid of anything. Even if there was a mutated nest next to him, it did not matter. Perhaps it was because of Gong Qi's impudence that in the fire god ant nest a dozen meters away, the billions of fire god ants that were working hard became restless. These movements and reactions were quickly reflected in their group consciousness. Restlessness and hostility were like sparks and oil colliding, igniting at the slightest touch. Hee, these little things. Gong Qi did not mind being like many research teams at all, coming to the center and bringing out the queen of the fire god ant colony as a captive to conduct in-depth research. From their behavior just now, they really had a lot of research value. But in the next second, his gaze turned to the fire god ant nest. He suddenly felt that something was wrong. Why did the style of this nest look so familiar? Also, The group consciousness of the fire god ants that had already ignited did not rush up to kill like the low-level creatures. Instead, it was accumulating and circulating the heat. In a breath's time, its influence and interference pattern had already exceeded the range of Gong Qi's judgment. It spread rapidly to a wider area, almost like a prairie fire. Boom boom. The lava beneath him stirred. Sparks from the group consciousness of the fire god ants splashed. The already burning fluid seemed to have peeled off a layer of old skin. The dark red layer of light on the surface, under the effect of the explosively rising heat, split into pieces. What replaced it was an even brighter and more dazzling yellow-white light. The entire underground cavern was illuminated as bright as day by the sudden burst of light. It was so bright that Gong Qi's spirit body was penetrated by the light and became a lot fainter. Gong Qi looked at all of this in a daze. He watched as the temperature of the lava rose abnormally. Very quickly, it exceeded the normal upper limit of the natural world. From 800 to 900 degrees, it shot up to 3,000 to 4,000 degrees. And the huge pressure that created all of this sank from the mental plane to the physical plane. Very quickly, it surged back up, forming a wonderful two-way cycle. And pressure and temperature, mental and physical, were perfectly unified, forming a stable and solid closed loop. This series of changes originated from the effect of the fire god ants' group consciousness. But in the process of this effect, there was clearly an even stronger core. Gong Qi finally reacted. He locked onto his vision and senses, staring at the huge ant nest in the turbulent lava space that connected the top and bottom of the cavern. Under the effect of high temperature and high pressure, parts of the ant nest structure could not withstand it and fell off. However, it wrapped around the base of the coarse stone pillars. Even if it stood in the hottest lava, it did not change shape or shake at all. Furthermore, it was absorbing the high-temperature fluid that was close to being in a gaseous and liquid state, causing it to flow through the structure of the ant nest. It became a circulating bloodline. The energy and qi activity thus linked up and continued to operate and upgrade. The ant nest was like a mountain, and the lava was like water. Yet this landscape was as malevolent as hell. It integrated the group consciousness of billions of fire god ants and gave it an even more warped and restless quality. More importantly, there was a higher level of power here: blood, blood, blood. Fire, fire, fire. Gong Qi's expression changed. Blood flame order, do you have a death wish? Although that was what he said, under the extreme environment of high temperature and high pressure, the fanatical and devout power of faith was like a prairie fire. It filled all the space of consciousness that Gong Qi could sense. It possessed direct lethality, but it also contained a deep and violent venom. It burned, eroded, and entangled without care. Even Gong Qi had to fend it off in a fluster for a moment. At this moment, an ethereal voice of laughter came through the air. Chapter 793. It was a woman's voice, but this wasn't the main point. It was somewhat familiar, but it didn't matter. What truly tormented him was the information contained within the laughter, especially when the words "Mr. Luo" came out. The 10 or so words that naturally extended behind it transformed into sharp knives. They sliced back and forth in his heart, forcefully carving out a face. Luonan. The young face transformed from the human face relief was carved into his heart. It gazed coldly at him, seemingly mocking this old man who refused to accept reality. Gong Qi's mind was in chaos at this moment. It could not be cut off, it could not be extinguished. The piercing words were admittedly a primer. The more practical reason was that this lava cavern had already transformed into a domain controlled by the laws of the Blood Soul Temple. It originated from the extreme melancholy and despairing power of the battlefield. It possessed a powerful ability to infect and assimilate. The Vulcan ant nest was vaguely the structure of the Blood Soul Temple. Gong Qi still vaguely remembered the relevant information. The physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple was something that the Blood Flame Order had not been able to accomplish even at its peak, let alone after it had split apart. Now that it had taken form, it had become a preset battlefield. It had been set up as a trap, and it had been set up specifically for him. It was simply shameful. Everyone else would suffer interference and suppression within this domain, but the Blood Flame Order could obtain an inexhaustible amount of power from within. And there was only one woman who could control this domain in the main and branches of the Blood Flame Order. Gong Qi forcefully suppressed the fluctuations in his heart and shifted his gaze. Diagonally below him, in the boiling lava surrounding the fire god ant nest, a slender woman was slowly rising up. She was not wearing a single piece of clothing. There were no clothes in this world that could preserve such a high temperature that could melt gold and iron. The same was true for a normal human body. But this woman had indeed risen up from the lava. She had a calm demeanor. Mrs. Halder. Gong Qi's mind went berserk when he saw this scene. He spoke coldly after half a second had passed. Since when did the Blood Flame Order become a lapdog under the feet of a little doll? The only response he received was a strange smile. When Mrs. Halder lifted the corner of her lips, a fiery red light shot out from her facial features and even her delicate and thin skin. It was as if she was engulfed by raging flames from the inside out. She was about to turn into ashes in the next moment. But in reality, she wasn't. The red light gushing out from her body was actually a sign of the high temperature and high pressure, as well as the complete mixing of blood essence and vitality. In Gong Qi's eyes, this was undoubtedly the interference control level of an extraordinary. No, not control. Gong Qi's eyes were very sharp. He quickly discovered that Lady Halder didn't put any effort into balancing the internal and external forces at all. This woman had chosen to be a great Satan, allowing the structure of the Blood Soul Temple to naturally suppress the situation. Her thoughts were purified and condensed, forming a sharp light that swam through the destructive heat, messing with the fragile balance at will. Are you crazy? You are under the control of others? Why would you risk your life for Luo Nan? Now, Gong Qi seriously needed an explanation to understand the core logic behind this series of unforeseen events. But what he had been waiting for was Lady Halder smiling and pouncing at him. The lava cavern glowed brightly with red light, and the temperature inside had clearly risen again. The high temperature and high pressure environment did not cause much harm to Gong Qi's spirit body, but under the manipulation of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, the storm formed by the reverse interference abyssal region still posed a considerable threat. Lady Halder was the first ablatum of the Blood Flame Order. Although her strength had yet to reach the extraordinary level, she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's configuration in the abyssal region. She could not be underestimated. On the other hand, Gong Qi's fleshly body had been damaged, and his foundation in the abyssal region had collapsed. He had no choice but to be careful. What the hell was going on? Gong Qi was guarding against the storm stirred up by the abyssal region, but what Lady Halder was pointing at was merely her mental strength. This mental strength, which was hard to distinguish between real and fake, had clearly gone through inconceivable tempering. It had condensed into an unparalleled edge, and it chopped down without regard for anything. Gong Qi's defensive mode and offensive direction were completely different. Gong Qi's spirit body was nearly pierced through by the sharp edge. Even though he dodged quickly, the structure of his spirit body seemed to have been scorched by raging flames. There were faint signs of warping and floating. This was the heart incineration blade. Gong Qi quickly grasped the core of Lady Halder's secret offensive technique, and his mind became a bit chaotic. He clearly knew that this secret technique had been publicized to the world long ago, and that many B-rank powers were cultivating it, but he still immediately associated it with Wu Jiong. Luo Nan, Lady Halder? It wouldn't be strange if there was another person behind them. At this time, Lady Halder chopped down once more. She really did treat herself as a fleshly body, and she was burning her blood and energy. Her fleshly body was on the brink of life and death. She attacked in a direct manner, without holding back at all. Scram! Gong Qi's emotions exploded. The green-gray essence energy that was intertwined with his life and energy swept down from the outer layer of his spirit body. It connected with Lady Halder's mental strength. This attack truly held nothing back. It was like 10,000 years of frigid ice in the polar regions. It forcefully froze the heart incineration blade and seized the opportunity to pierce through. It wanted to break Lady Halder's fragile balance and end the battle quickly. The red light was a bit chaotic, and the green-gray energy charged back, polluting the originally transparent domain of the Blood Soul Temple. It even seeped into Lady Halder's body. Lady Halder's body froze, and the old scar on her cheek seemed to tear open once more. The flames were like vipers as they slithered across her cheek. It was like a second flame had been lit. After a brief moment of chaos, the penetrating red light erupted once more. It forcefully expelled the corrosive power of Gong Qi's essence energy, and it charged forth once more. The green-gray essence energy and the sharp edge instantly intersected and separated. In the blink of an eye, they coiled around each other and collided. In the time it took for an ordinary person to take a breath, the two had exchanged over 30 blows. Later on, the high-frequency vibrations formed by the collision nearly tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple structure. A small portion of the lava cavern had already collapsed, and this was only the result of the attack on the mental plane interfering with the material plane. Suddenly, there was a long hiss. Lady Halder's body was struck solid by the enormous force. Her entire body was like a fiery meteor as she smashed heavily into the high-temperature lava. She was less than half a meter away from the physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple. The fiery glow of the lava instantly engulfed over half of this structure, and quite a few fragments were smashed down. However, the main body remained majestic and unmoving. What a pity! Gong Qi cried to himself. The most direct method was to break the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and destroy its foundation on the material plane. However, Lady Halder was quite strange. She was still able to forcefully control herself even in such a passive situation. Her momentum was thwarted, but she did not fall into chaos. Of course, even if she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, she would certainly pay a price for clashing with an extraordinary at the level of an architect. Gong Qi could see that Lady Halder's body had truly ignited with flames. The flesh of her chest, abdomen, and limbs were charred black, and the outline of her body had shrunk in an extremely bizarre manner. Burning essence energy and burning flesh. How ruthless! Gong Qi felt his heart burn as he watched Lady Halder's aura rise and fall. The one before him was Lady Halder, but he was thinking about something else in his heart. Just what version of the bewitching curse did Luo Nen use to make the head of a religion risk her life to fight? If things were to continue like this, then even if he broke through the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, his losses would far exceed his estimations. Chapter 794. Gong Qi had a certain realization. He was within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The operation of the opponent's power and the corresponding rules had already formed a closed loop. He was fighting in the domain of an enemy extraordinary. This was a strategic defeat. The basic starting conditions were already very difficult to change or reverse. Under these circumstances, while enduring the corresponding pressure, he had to plan a corresponding counterattack. He had to start from the tactical details and do his best to seize back the initiative. Taking the initiative was not the same as charging in and attacking. On the contrary, Gong Qi's attitude was more conservative. The greatest benefit of a conservative attitude was that he could maintain a cool head, restrain his consumption, and do his best to precisely allocate resources in order to deal with the possible changes in the future. In theory, this should be the case. However, Gong Qi felt that this wasn't the case after a round of confrontation. On the contrary, the consumption was clearly lower than what he had predicted. The greatest possibility was that the high temperature and high pressure of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and the corresponding law environment could form an even stronger suppression on him, creating an even greater consumption. Moreover, this was the case. Gong Qi didn't take advantage of the situation to pursue and attack. He stared at Lady Halder, observing the changes in her state. The strength of the opponent's blood and energy was declining, but her internal cohesion and sharpness didn't decrease. Oh, her blood and energy were replenished from the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. Was she planning on fighting a protracted battle? No, that wasn't right. This woman's motives weren't simple at all on the mental level. Gong Qi spoke half mockingly and half probingly. The body and mind are like blades, the domain is like a furnace, and I'm here to stir up the wind and hammer. Not a bad idea. You want me to coordinate with you? It's not up to you. Gong Qi was stupefied again. He didn't know what kind of attitude he should take. Lady Halder was smiling at this time. She completely disregarded her own burning flesh and her damaged state. She pounced forward once more. She didn't control the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and instead engaged in a killing style. This sort of unsettled ambition. Did she look down on the first ablatum of her order? It was truly absurd to the point where one couldn't laugh. Gong Qi didn't care about the future of the Blood Flame Order, but why did he have to encounter such an expert who didn't care about fame and position, who didn't even care about life? For a time, Gong Qi was a bit annoyed from being pestered, but his train of thought was still clear. Luo Nan had set up an ambush for him here, so Luo Nan most likely had a backup plan. After all, Mrs. Halder was barely qualified to be used as a sniper, but she wasn't quite qualified to be the decisive character. It must be known that the might of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple was extraordinary. If he continued to delay here, it would be fine if that kid Luo Nan chased after him. But if he waited for Ouyang Chen, Wu Jiong, and the like to take action, then his life would most likely end here. But then again, if the Transcendents wanted to set up an ambush, why did they have to complicate matters and have Madame Halder take the lead? This was an unnecessary move. The logic behind this was simply too confusing. Just who was behind Luo Nan? What kind of dirty tricks were they going to play? When is he going to use that move? Gong Qi's thoughts were intertwined and he found it hard to calm down. He was even more unwilling to tangle with Lady Halder. This woman's willpower is commendable, but strength is what matters. She wants to rely on the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to fight a protracted battle and sharpen her blade? Does she really think my extraordinary domain is just for show? With a single thought, the curtain unfurled, and smoke filled the air. The thin smoke was unremarkable within the forge-like domain of the Blood Soul Temple, but the veins of laws that came from the rank of an extraordinary were real. Since Gong Qi's foundation in the Abyss District had been damaged and collapsed, he no longer had the main axis of dispatching. His originally advantageous extraordinary domain had enormous flaws, so he couldn't help but be cautious. Therefore, he didn't take the initiative to activate his domain to interfere. He just wanted to observe and examine the situation, and then take the initiative to strike later. Now was his chance. Even though Gong Qi's own structure of laws was already full of flaws, he could still easily and delightfully destroy them. Within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, the battle circle surrounding the two was inexplicably cool. Visually, the smoke curtain was faintly discernible, but its existence truly disrupted the transmission of energy. It caused a clear difference in temperature between the inside and outside of the curtain. Of course, it was impossible to completely isolate it. But under the strangulation of the chaotic laws, Gong Qi was 100% certain that he could destroy the stability of the transmission tunnel and disrupt Madame Halder's food supply route. He could pull the rug from under her. Madame Halder's qi and blood surged into the heavens. She revealed her sharpness, and a bright light slashed through the air. Unexpectedly, she wasn't affected at all, and her aura flourished even more. When it was Gong Qi's turn, his mind was in a daze. The heart-burning blade really did slash at him on the mental plane. A portion of his spiritual body structure burned and evaporated. Even if he didn't lose his foundation, he was still injured. One slash, Madame Halder muttered softly. Just by looking at her smile, there was no malevolence in battle. Instead, it was like she was playing cards with her best friend during afternoon tea. Very good. Gong Qi couldn't care less about this small injury. He activated his extraordinary domain, the curtain, and retracted it. There was even a greenish-gray stream of energy circulating within it. It almost formed a dark cloud in the lava cavern, forcefully distorting the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He no longer held back in his methods. It was completely a battle between extraordinaries. Their domains would collide and suppress each other. Originally, he wanted to conserve his strength to deal with an unknown enemy, but the omen on Madame Halder's side wasn't good, it was rising. Gong Qi's heart twitched once more. No matter how miraculous the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain was, the interference and distortion of the two domains should have long since messed up the energy transmission tunnel. However, Madame Halder was clearly burning and consuming a large amount of qi and blood at every moment. Yet, her recovery process was uninterrupted, undisturbed, and undiminished. Although she didn't recover all at once, the steady rhythm of the night rain rising without him realizing it formed a strong contrast with Gong Qi's unrestrained methods and his unstoppable consumption of qi and blood. There was something fishy going on. Gong Qi stared at Madame Halder and sensed his own body. Comparing the two, the fuzzy feeling gradually became clearer. It wasn't the Blood Soul Temple's domain at work. At the very least, it wasn't the main structure, it was just a cover. Madame Halder charged forward again without any fear. Every time she slashed out, she burned her qi and blood without holding back. But no matter how she tossed and turned, there would always be a return, in a timely manner. No, it was an immediate injection. There was no internal or external conduction or transformation process. It was as if her body had a blood return device. However, when Gong Qi eliminated the information interference of the Blood Soul Temple's domain and compared Madame Halder's blood recovery with his own consumption, he clearly sensed a certain relationship between the ebb and flow of the fluctuations. Is she drawing my blood? No, she doesn't have the ability to do so. There's still a middle link. In other words, there might be a middle link. While drawing my blood, the extracted power is converted into universal energy and then injected into Madame Halder's body. What a joke! Gong Qi found it hard to accept such an absurd guess. Chapter 795. After a few seconds of absent-mindedness, Gong Qi seemed to hear something. The subtle sound seemed to be hidden behind the cries and praises of the Blood Soul Temple domain, blood, 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 fire, fire, fire. It was even more distant and even more chaotic. Gong Qi's thoughts traced upwards, and the degree of chaos continued to rise. It was as if he had arrived at the center of a metropolis. There were streams of people everywhere. He closed his eyes, and he could hear the clamor of human voices echoing at all times. He was clearly spying on Yue, but on this level he was practically drowned out by the clamor of sound. Fortunately, he was rich in experience, and he promptly adjusted the wrong direction of his senses. He no longer pondered and analyzed the details of the clamor of voices. Instead, he strove to capture the general characteristics of the chaos. Luo Nan. Even if it was Luo Nan, that damned young man. Just what sort of standard did he use to gather such an enormous flood of information? Actually, if one were to seriously consider it, there was a thread to follow. The domain of the Blood Soul Temple, the burning of Mrs. Halder's blood and energy, the extreme beliefs of blood and fire. There had to be some connection hidden behind these materialized things. Was it the psychic power of the believers, the call, the prayer? No, it was something even more primitive. It had yet to form concrete logic. Then it was emotion. What sort of emotion was it? It was fear. Bit by bit, Gong Qi analyzed and sensed until he captured the most crucial clue. His train of thought suddenly became clear and broadened. That's right, it was fear. On the chaotic information plane, there existed the terror and panic of not knowing what to do. There was also the ruthlessness and savagery of a cornered beast. These two reactions were nearly polar, yet they were unified on the most essential core. All of this was piled up, operating, and pressurized on this hidden plane. It was like a high-temperature furnace that was endlessly adding fuel. Every participant was consciously and unconsciously speeding up this process, even if this required them to pay endlessly and consume energy until they became weak and dazed. Such matters were not rare in the inner world. Gong Qi used his experience to quickly determine the nature of the matter. Sacrifice. Luo Nan was conducting a sacrificial ritual. This sort of ritual used a so-called high-dimensional structure to exchange a low-level resource for a high-level resource. Mrs. Halder was cooperating with him. Or to be more precise, she was the one who knew and carried out this ritual. The Blood Flame Order was a secret organization that was best at utilizing extreme emotions such as fear and anger. The Blood Soul Temple was the most efficient organization in utilizing such emotions. However, according to Gong Qi's previous senses, the Blood Soul Temple was not the main body. It was in a subsidiary position, perhaps only a pillar in the structure. This pillar was also burning furiously right now. It was essentially no different from those who had sacrificed their essence, blood, and vitality in fear and fury. No, it should be said that it burned more fiercely and more extreme. The chi-chi sound of the airflow was not only in the material plane, but also in Gong Qi's mind. Every rise and fall carried a scorching sharpness. Madame Halder's attacks seemed to have no end, and the sharpness of her attacks seemed to have no upper limit. At least until her body and vitality were completely incinerated. Gong Qi forced her back again and again, slamming her against the stone walls of the cave and into the lava. He shattered her bones and imprisoned her vital energy. However, this overwhelming advantage was unable to grind away Madame Halder's most essential core. She had already abandoned everything. Only her heart shone with an extreme sharpness. This sort of situation shouldn't have appeared. Her mental willpower was as firm as diamond, but it was unable to resist the decay and collapse of her material foundation. But today, Madame Halder brought out the most extreme and cruel method. She had abandoned everything, and she had used the most brilliant method to abandon everything. She had placed herself, and perhaps even the entire system of the Blood Flame Order, on the altar constructed by Luo Nan. She carried out a sacrifice in exchange for support that far exceeded the limits of her abilities. This was, without a doubt, a gamble. Even if Madame Halder was still alive after this battle, she would basically be half-cooked. She would spend the rest of her life on a sickbed, a life worse than death. Unless she could seize the spiritual opportunity in this battle and make a breakthrough, becoming an extraordinary. She could modify and reconstruct the structure of her body. Why was she so confident in Luo Nan? As it turned out, her confidence was rewarded. She abandoned everything in exchange for the limitless potential to break through all shackles. Compared to the force of impact on the material plane, Madame Halder's will was tempered to a peerless sharpness. Every time they clashed, even if her attacks were blasted into disarray, Gong Qi would suffer the cuts of her sharp will. Distracting thoughts rose one after another, and it became harder and harder for his mind to harmonize. Of course, this wasn't just the effect of Madame Halder's attacks. Gong Qi really didn't understand. It was fine if Madame Halder was willing to sacrifice herself, but why was he unwittingly falling into the trap as well? Was it because of the pull of the battle's energy, the mutual attacks? Oh no. As an extraordinary, the energy around Gong Qi's body was a body of its own. It possessed its own rules. He was the only one who assimilated others. He shouldn't be easily drawn into another system. At least, this was the case on the level of energy manipulation. But if he eliminated all of this, he would think deeper and more primitive. Using fear as the foundation for the standard of sacrifice meant that he himself fulfilled the requirements? Was he in fear? Gong Qi instinctively wanted to cut off this thought, but the illusory yet real connection of energy within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and the corresponding rational analysis told him there was no point in deceiving himself. That's right. He was afraid. In the misty labyrinth, he was afraid of Luo Nan's series of plans and the gradual realization of Luo Nan's firm execution ability. In the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, he was afraid of Madame Halder's extreme willpower to abandon everything. Even if this woman's goal wasn't pure, through the method of sacrifice, she formed a perfect fusion with Luo Nan's goal. Observing the enemy was like looking into a mirror. When the enemy's design was flawless, the flaws on his side were reflected particularly clearly. No matter how much Gong Qi denied it, he was afraid in the end. He was afraid of defeat. He was afraid of death. He was afraid of cutting off his path forward. Yet all of this was concealed under the shameful mentality of being thwarted by a junior. He consoled himself and deceived himself. There was a flaw in his heart, but he was unaware of it. This gave the other side an opportunity to take advantage of him. "I have to be steady," Gong Chi shouted to himself. The light of spiritual wisdom illuminated the unbearable corner of his heart. He felt terrible, but he was far from being in a hopeless situation. Thinking about it seriously, Luo Nan tossed and turned so much, one step after another. Wasn't it all for the sake of creating a flaw in Gong Chi's heart and baiting him? But Gong Chi was an extraordinary. What was it that gave Luo Nan the confidence to construct a framework to trap extraordinaries? What level of knowledge and power was that? From top to bottom, there were nearly 100 extraordinaries in the inner world. They represented the highest level of martial power on earth. Gong Chi had been Deputy Secretary General for several decades. He had gratitude and grudges, hatred and friendship with these people. He was truly able to count them like the back of his hand. Right now, he used the most rational and objective state of mind to go through the list of these people and the powers they belong to. From the Ability User Society to the 3 Great Secret Orders. From the big shots who sat on the ground and divided the spoils, to the wandering heroes. Then the answer he obtained was none. Not a single powerful person or power that had connections to Luo Nan, who had grudges with him, who had the strength and qualifications to set up a killing trap. This was normal. Otherwise, extraordinaries wouldn't be the peak combat power of the world. Gong Chi had toiled painstakingly for several decades in the Ability User Society. There was no meaning in that. So, calm down. Don't scare yourself. Gong Chi shouted to himself once more. Even though Luo Nan had constructed these structures, he really couldn't understand them. The complex and profound details hidden deep beneath the simple principles of sacrifice were still daunting to look at. But if Luo Nan really did have an overwhelming advantage, why would he need to do such complex preparatory work? This was more like a dazzling display of deterrence. It was an exquisite but limited method. He had experience in dealing with such methods. You don't have the chance. Suddenly, a voice cut in. After a long time, Mrs. Halder finally took the initiative to speak to him. Her throat was roasted by the high temperature. It was hoarse and unpleasant to listen to, but it was like the final verdict. It was very ear-piercing. You are the first ablatum, yet you destroy the order for your own selfish desires. You evil woman, you dare to disturb my mind. Gong Chi's reply went straight to the root of the problem after reconstructing his mental state. It was much sharper, and the corresponding method was even more straightforward and fierce. The ashen cloud suddenly boiled and expanded as it faced Mrs. Halder's flying bloody light. It towered high like a cliff, and its color darkened. It was like a cumulonimbus cloud in summer. It was bloated and enormous, and its top crystallized. It forcefully resisted the high temperature of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, forming a powerful counteracting force. The hazy cloud was like a pillar that could smash the heavens. It forcefully split apart the foundation of the laws of the Blood Soul Temple's domain on the material plane. It painted this land of lava with a completely rebellious color. It also turned the most active and resolute woman into an insignificant reptile. The rumble of the collapsing airflow directly suppressed the rumbling of the boiling and exploding lava. It was as if a snowstorm had come from beyond the heavens. It crushed the rock strata who knew how deep it was, and a bone-chilling coldness descended. The forceful distortion and interference of the extraordinary domain suppressed the rules of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. The other was the all-out attack of an extraordinary. Mrs. Halder was blasted flying once more. Gong Chi's mental state had made a decision, and he had finally achieved enough pressure on the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He destroyed the relevant environment, and a portion of the force even pierced through the structure of the domain and landed on the periphery. The lava cavern began to collapse, and the passageway leading to the ant nest suffered the attack. Tens of thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated into ashes every second. The Vulcan ant group consciousness, which was an important support for the Blood Soul Temple's domain, also suffered the attack. Gong Qi was confident that he could completely shatter the Blood Soul Temple's domain after another 2 or 3 rounds of attacks of this level. More importantly, Gong Qi gained a more detailed understanding of the environment he faced as the extraordinary domains interfered and collided with each other. First, Luo Nan's entangling net frame construction was much more ingenious than Gong Qi's second judgment. Although Luo Nan's previous attacks had already disturbed the Blood Soul Temple's domain that supported Mrs. Halder, the deeper layers of incorporeal frames and restraints still towered silently. They were simultaneously erected on the material and mental planes. They seemed incorporeal yet incorporeal. No matter how the lava surged and the storm wreaked havoc in the abyssal region, they were not affected. Was this really Luo Nan's doing? It didn't look like it. It really didn't look like it. Such a construction, such a penetrating research, such a deep thought, and such an ingenious frame faintly surpassed the level of the abyssal region. It probed towards an even higher level. According to Gong Qi's understanding, perhaps only powerful people like that old ghost Abner or the leaders of the 3 great secret orders had the qualifications to touch upon this. If this really was the case, but wasn't this going against the logic of just being smooth? Then this was some sort of result that had yet to enter the scope of the inner world's attention. Luo Nan already had the cloud world, so having such a high-end structure was nothing. As for how Luo Nan was going to support the foundation of this structure, to allow it to exist and operate, this was a difficult problem that could only be solved at the end of the matter. Compared to this difficult problem that was hard to explain, Gong Qi discovered a second point that made him relax a bit. He cast aside his fear and stretched out his mental senses after smashing the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He did not discover Luo Nan's second trump card. Aside from the sacrificial structure that was so exquisite that it was unreal, there were no other extraordinary level powers within the range of his senses. Luo Nan, this young man, really only used Lady Halder and the Blood Soul Temple system as his final method of intercepting and killing him. Or perhaps, it was a hook to pull him into a trap. Was this an extraordinary self-confidence, or was this a compromise made out of helplessness? Or perhaps there was a dangerous enemy that possessed absolute patience, preparing an even more fatal ambush from afar? None of this was important. The structure of Gong Qi's pupils in his spirit body was infected by the greenish-gray essence energy. A thick pillar of cloud of the same color wrapped around his tyrannical laws and will. It collided with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple once more, emitting an earth-shaking rumble. A second attack without any misgivings. The entire lava cavern swayed and swayed. Flames burst forth chaotically. Gong Qi's top priority was no longer to delve into the details of the enemy's mentality. This was because the expanded mental sense network marked out a narrow but absolutely safe area for him. With this distance as a buffer, Gong Qi was confident that he could escape unscathed even if there were powerful enemies lying in ambush in the indiscernible outer region. After all, he possessed the top-notch teleportation technique in the world. As long as he destroyed the enormous source of interference that was the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, he could make the surrounding space-time environment relatively stable. Even if it was only for a short second, it would be enough for him to escape 1,000 kilometers away. Before, Luo Nan had used the Cloud World, the Mist Maze, and the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to suppress Gong Qi's ability. But now, it was impossible for Luo Nan to return to these 2 damned places. The remaining source of interference that seemed troublesome could no longer be called troublesome without the most dreadful potential threat. Yes, it couldn't. The greenish-gray cumulonimbus cloud suddenly swayed for a moment. The upper layer isolated the high temperature and pressure. The cloud layer spontaneously condensed at the top. Perhaps the appearance of the cloud layer was too similar to certain meteorological conditions in the natural world. Crackling sparks of electricity flashed at the front where the low-temperature cloud layer and the high-temperature domain made close contact. Gong Qi's pupils were already immersed in greenish-gray light. They flickered with a glimmer, then froze. The light above the cloud layer only flickered for a brief moment. But at this moment, it was precisely these minute sparks of electricity that caused a certain inauspicious shadow to reveal a bit of its silhouette. It was still growing. It was still climbing. It was like a tree that twisted and struggled its way out of the crevice of hell. Every time it manifested, it represented the growth of multiple dimensions: length, surface area, volume, aura intensity, power level. No, this wasn't growth. This was an explosive proliferation. Gongqi was certain that he had captured the existence of his adversary in time. The adversary was right on the front where his extraordinary domain distorted and interfered with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The adversary was close at hand, and the adversary could interfere at any time. He really did react. Due to the ominous feeling in his heart, he had the thought of nipping the threat in the bud. His methods were fierce and straightforward. This was the third attack. It was slightly inferior to the previous one, but its subtlety far surpassed it. The undulating energy within that region was completely frozen and sucked dry. This sort of suction was so fierce that even the structure of space and time trembled. A small portion of it was annihilated, releasing an even more violent attack. This level of interference pointed directly to the microscopic level. Only the skill and experience of an extraordinary was able to achieve such a powerful effect under the premise that his mental senses were unable to completely comprehend and control the changes on this level. Unsurprisingly, the domain of the Blood Soul Temple was distorted and torn apart once again. It seemed that it would be difficult to mend it in a short period of time. The rock stratum at the top of the cavern exploded. The originally invisible shockwave was arrogantly exposed through the countless wide cracks that radiated in all directions and continued to extend. The source of all the cracks was the pitch-black hole in the rock stratum. The edge of the hole was smeared with the light formed by the interweaving lava and the greenish-gray cloud pillar. The light itself seemed to possess a corrosive power. It caused the newly formed hole to show signs of collapse in the blink of an eye. According to Gongqi's calculations, the ominous shadow that was explosively proliferating should have been damaged at the same time as the hole. It should have touched the ceiling of its power level. Its soaring momentum was interrupted and it rapidly fell. It was then caught and suppressed by the greenish-gray cloud pillar. In reality, after the greenish-gray cloud pillar tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, it had already stirred up its remaining momentum. It was going to smash into the center of the rock stratum and not give the ominous shadow any chance to dodge. The other party did not dodge, but correspondingly, the explosive growth momentum that caused one's heart to palpitate did not weaken in the slightest. It did not seem to be affected at all. It did not give Gongqi any chance to react at all. With that seemingly natural pace, it crushed through the ceiling that ability users from the inner world could not touch. It was like a flight of stairs that a normal person would casually step on. On the front where the greenish-gray cloud pillar and the Blood Soul Temple's domain contorted and collided, brilliant electric flames flickered once again. They struck and shuttled through the dark-colored cloud pillar, but it was not just a display of power. This was because the countless areas of electric light were formed from innumerable anions, cations, and water molecules. Under insufficient or even completely contradictory material conditions, in the complex environment where the extraordinary domain distorted and interfered, they accurately corresponded with the precise structures from other dimensions. They interfered with each other and quickly constructed a tyrannical and stable order of a different kind. Chapter 796. Since it couldn't be shaken, a counterforce followed. Compared to a physical shockwave, a psychological shockwave would explode much earlier. Extraordinary! In Gongqi's eyes, the greenish-gray color that seemed to be sealed in ice cracked. At this moment, the colors and luminosity in front of his eyes rapidly changed. The hole in the rock formation that had just been pierced through was originally colored by the flames and dark clouds. Now, a pure and dazzling light gathered, like the muzzle of a giant spaceship that was accumulating energy and waiting to fire. Dazzling light waves also leaped out from the depths of the distorted cracks. However, there were no signs of leakage. All there was seemingly infinite convergence, binding, and compression. The top of the cloud pillar that was about to smash into the rock formation directly collapsed. The newly constructed region of laws at the entrance of the hole wasn't big, but it was so solid that it left one in despair. And it was precisely this solid strength that had firmly locked onto Gong Qi's location within the greenish-gray cloud pillar. It was unwavering and unwavering. In an instant, the offensive and defensive positions switched. Gong Qi, who had already grasped the absolute initiative, suddenly became the hunting target of others. F***CK. Amidst Gong Qi's rare curse, the greenish-gray cumulonimbus cloud that was like a towering cliff suddenly collapsed, and the illusory cloud scattered in all directions. A portion of it quickly evaporated under the high temperature and pressure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, but most of it settled and expanded, occupying more areas. It also projected Gong Qi's unique laws into a wider range. In that instant, the temperature of the Blood Soul Temple domain dropped as a whole. Gong Qi's laws formed sufficient interference. Even though it was still far from achieving its goal of suppression, it still gave Gong Qi a chance to move in an extremely short period of time. With a hum, the clouds in the area where Gong Qi was trembled. His spirit body fluctuated with the tremors before turning incorporeal. Almost at the same time, the ionization channel structure was completed. A dazzling electric dragon rumbled down, completely evaporating the clouds and the corresponding laws where Gong Qi was. The air, already distorted under the high temperature and pressure, no longer had the ability to expand or make a sound. It looked like a frozen scene, but it was still shocking. There was no doubt that it was an extraordinary level technique. Gong Qi's figure appeared 50 meters away. At that critical moment, he had relied on the interference of the cloud's laws and the corresponding teleportation technique to escape. However, he did not relax in the slightest. There was only unresolvable fear in his heart. Who's that over there? The abyssal zone was sturdy and stable, so it was definitely a psychic. Not to mention, it was the electromagnetic field with the widest range of interference. It seemed like there was no such person in the inner plane. It couldn't be the government or the military, right? Before he could react, another surprise attack came. Behind Gong Qi, Madame Halder followed the strange gravitational pull of the net frame and caught onto Gong Qi's teleportation destination. She silently arrived, and a blood-red light pierced through. Get lost! With a low shout, Gong Qi forcefully pushed back the bloodlight that had pounced at him. This was an unfair collision. Amidst the chaotic bloodlight, Madame Halder was no longer even recognizable as a human. But that incorporeal blade was accompanied by a mocking laugh. It was as if it had been smeared with corrosive poison, and it stabbed right into his heart. The taste of fear is actually not bad. Gong Qi seemed to have suffered another heavy punch. In his spirit-body state, he had abandoned most of his useless physiological emotions, like a dried-up river. But at this moment, the stimulation from the explosion had replaced the transmission of neurotransmitters with an even more direct psychic wave current. It had created an even more tragic wound and crack. He had just finished mentally preparing himself and reconstructed his analysis of the situation and corresponding strategies. The heavy punch that came smashing at him didn't just smash his face, it also smashed the foundation of his survival. His mind was in a daze. At this moment, the long scar left by the lightning dragon was still lingering in the clouds, and the light waves in the cracks in the rock stratum had already begun to gather for the second time. His attention was inevitably drawn to it. If the lightning cannons above his head were to fire continuously, and each strike had the same might as the one just now, oh no! Signs of danger suddenly appeared. It didn't come from the cannons above him, but from the trajectory of the lightning dragon. Just as the lightning intersected with the lava at the bottom, a figure suddenly burst out. Taking advantage of the gap in Gong Qi's absent-minded state, the figure instantly crushed through the domain space that was still trembling and arrived with a loud bang. There really was a cannonball in the lightning cannon that had just been fired. Gong Qi had avoided the first attack, but he ultimately couldn't avoid the second. The threat came suddenly and fiercely. The tyrannical rule interference distorted and destroyed Gong Qi's mental sensing network. He could capture the other party's momentum, but he couldn't further analyze it. He instinctively wanted to teleport far away again, but the surrounding turbulent rule environment didn't give him the chance. Helplessly, The green-gray light around his body flickered and extinguished. He gathered the clouds and forcefully constructed the rule to form a sturdy barrier. However, the barrier had just formed when it was forcefully blasted apart. An arm wrapped in metal armor, similarly wrapped in dazzling lightning, blasted toward him. Physical side. His initial judgment was instantly overturned. They were both electromagnetic directions, but how could the mental side and physical side be the same? Especially in his haste, the other party had actually closed in on him. The tyrannical chi and blood in his body rushed back to the abyss area, forming the most troublesome interference field. If his foundation in the abyss area was still intact, he could still forcefully pull it up to a higher level and move toward the polar domain to obtain space to move around. But now that his foundation was destroyed, he would be a beat slower even if he were to improvise during normal times. How could he engage in close combat? Gong Qi's heart palpitated. Almost at the same time, the lightning fist struck his face. The structure of his spirit body collapsed with a hum, and then it entangled with the green-gray essence energy around him. It was as if a gale had swept through the clouds and dispersed in all directions. This was thanks to Gong Qi's out-of-body state, which allowed him to disperse so easily and avoid the frontal attack. But the person who punched didn't make a sound. He slightly retracted his fist, and his body wrapped in exoskeleton armor spun along with the momentum of the fist. It was precisely this spin that instantly transformed the violent impact into a fist stance that was ready to be launched. It could be withdrawn at will, and its rotation was in no way weaker than Gong Qi's in his spirit body state. In particular, the electric current that leaped around his body supported a strong electromagnetic field on the physical plane and achieved a storm-like disturbance on the mental plane. This kind of switch between offense and defense, as well as powerful control of the field, reflected the stance of a top-notch expert. It was also because of this that Gong Qi couldn't help but expend a bit more effort to reassemble his spirit body. Instead, a certain name naturally flickered in his mind, and then it was shot out. Jin Tong. In Gong Qi's memory, there was only one extraordinaire who could control electromagnetic power by his side. Once he was alarmed, that familiar aura imprint was also peeled off from the outer shell of the exoskeleton armor and the strange skin membrane. It was reflected in his mind, and there was no doubt about it. Gong Qi's furious thoughts swept through the void, but it didn't trigger any additional reactions. The other party locked onto Gong Qi's spirit body again, and without a word, launched another round of violent attacks. Gong Qi's spirit body structure was once again destroyed with 2 or 3 punches. Jin Tong, you're King crazy. From what Gong Qi knew, Jin Tong was a top-notch wilderness hunter. The metal hunting group under him was quite powerful, and at the same time, he had a long-term cooperative relationship with the Ability User Association. After all, the association was the largest distributor of mutant resources in the inner world. Jin Tong's team's annual transactions with the association were in the hundreds of millions, and they involved quite a lot of premium products. To the other party, they were both important clients. With such a background, Gong Qi and Jin Tong naturally had a friendship. Even if they weren't best buddies, they still had contact every year. But what the hell was with the current situation? Gong Qi's mind was in turmoil. Countless thoughts rose and fell, combining into thousands of conspiracy possibilities. Like the shadows of trees swaying in the dark night, they unfolded in his heart. He knew that his condition was terrible, but he couldn't calm down for a moment. In just a few flashes of thought, his spirit body structure was once again destroyed. This time, it wasn't because he was actively disintegrating the force, but because it had really been smashed apart by the heavy punch. Gong Qi was really injured. Even though his spirit body was immune to attacks on the material plane, and he had a partial advantage over the fleshly body, this was still unable to completely dissolve Jin Tong's tyrannical blood energy. At the same time, his mental defenses, which had been damaged and then reconstructed, collapsed yet another corner. Countless invisible cracks spread out. This couldn't continue. This absolutely couldn't continue. Gong Qi still didn't understand why Jin Tong would stand by Luo Nan's side. Furthermore, Jin Tong had used the exoskeleton armor to hide his head but show his tail. Perhaps this was an unsolvable riddle. And the more realistic problem was that he had already completely lost the initiative after making consecutive misjudgments. Jin Tong was pressuring him at close range. Jin Tong's powerful fighting style, berserk attacks, and meticulous control of the field was even stronger than what Gong Qi knew. Jin Tong's state was clearly at its peak, and Jin Tong didn't give Gong Qi a chance to catch his breath. With Gong Qi's current half-crippled state, Gong Qi would probably be forcefully ground to death if things continued like this. Screw you. In this desperate situation, Gong Qi's greenish-gray pupils cracked like a layer of ice before shattering with a bang. In this moment, he completely abandoned the structure of his spirit body. He fused with his essence energy that had been tempered and tempered 1,000 times to form a haze of light that was half illusory and incorporeal. He forcefully invaded the lightning that coiled around Jin Tong's body. Gong Qi didn't disperse the structure of his spirit body to unload the force. Instead, he wanted to fight Jin Tong on a more detailed, more microscopic level. He wanted to crazily strangle Jin Tong. And the consumption that came from this would increase by several times, dozens of times. It was even possible that the core of Jin Tong's spirit body would be damaged. There would be no end to future troubles. His life was gone. Who cared about future troubles? Mrs. Halder controlled her bloody light to stop on the outskirts. She originally wanted to quietly cut in and seize some of the spoils of battle. But the situation entered the most intense level in the first instant. The blazing white lightning and the greenish-gray essence energy permeated and counter-permeated. They resisted and countered, stirring up a dark ring of fire. It noiselessly tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, isolating a deadly environment. Anyone who tried to force their way in would become the venting point for the clashing forces of two extraordinaries. They would suffer double the damage. She didn't have any chance to intervene. She could only drag her ruined body, quietly sense and wait. One of her eyes had already been blasted apart under the continuous clashes. The crystal had evaporated, but her mind's eye was clear and penetrating. Luo Nan's framework served as a probing needle, and it pierced straight into the depths of the enemy's heart. Gong Qi was truly going all out. He displayed an unprecedented decisiveness. The greenish-gray essence energy was like leaping icy flames within the area where he and Jin Tong fought. It possessed a water-like penetrative power, but it also contained a violent destructive power. The lightning that Jin Tong controlled had already interweaved into a net, but now this net began to warp violently. From time to time, the knots of the net would collapse, the lines would reconnect, and then the net would be reconstructed. The cycle continued. But Gong Qi was terrified. His mental defenses were damaged, reconstructed, and broken. The scars had already been deeply branded into the deepest recesses of his will. He was able to be this decisive right now because the cracks that had opened up were gushing flames of fury. They formed an explosive driving force. Fear and fury were two sides of the same coin. They could switch at any time. How long could Gong Qi last? Under the eruption of near uncontrollable power, under the suction of the framework net. Mrs. Halder furrowed her brows slightly. Within the dark ring of fire where the extraordinaries fought, a strange colored flame suddenly flickered. It came from Jin Tong's body, which had been as steady as a mountain. It was the exoskeleton armor wrapped around his body. A layer of flame had burned through it, leaving behind shallow scorch marks and ashes. And in the area where the flame had yet to burn out, the fascia-like foreign body that was wrapped around him was only an insignificant amount. It was still twitching under the roasting, as if it was alive. Tisk! Mrs. Halder could clearly hear someone smacking his tongue in annoyance. Gong Qi, who was within the ring of battle, felt it more directly. The pressure from Jin Tong's side suddenly dropped, and an inconceivable break appeared in the tempestuous rhythm of attacks. Chance. Gong Qi's thoughts had already fallen far behind his instinctive reactions in this moment where the rules and energy interweaved. He made the most correct action in an instant. The greenish-gray essence energy instantly converged. Its light and color were purified to the point of being nearly transparent. At the same time, it was tempered to a sharpness that exceeded the limits of its limits. It also possessed a dark damage that could corrode the soul. Under the guidance of the energy, it seized the break point that shouldn't have appeared and pierced straight in. The sharp essence energy spear directly pierced into the center of the exoskeleton armor's visor. It pierced through 2 layers of metal armor and the flesh and blood in the middle. It went forward and out, completely penetrating through. They had hit? At this moment, Gong Qi was somewhat at a loss. It wasn't easy for his lagging thoughts to catch up, but an irrelevant thought appeared in his mind. He remembered that Jin Tong was too casual when it came to controlling electromagnetic energy. He also had the special ability to transform his body into metal. The two complemented each other and were enough to support a complete system of rules. Therefore, he didn't really like it or was very good at cooperating with exoskeleton armor. It was also very difficult for there to be a vehicle in the world that was suitable for him to carry his extraordinary strength. Is this guy in front of me really Jin Tong? The sudden reversal of the situation also reversed the direction of the power. Gong Qi's attack caused the deadlock between the two to lose balance, and it poured out in the direction of the weaker side. The strength of the exoskeleton armor's structure couldn't withstand this level of impact. In the blink of an eye, it twisted and collapsed. Of course, the first to collapse was the visor that had suffered a direct hit. A strange bloody light seeped out. Gong Qi's senses pierced through the broken metal outer shell and the strange bloody light. He locked onto the distorted face that still gave him a familiar feeling. Jin Tong. No, it wasn't. At least not at certain times. In the bloody light, a blurry face that was still pierced by the essence Qi spear was melting. Jin Tong's facial features reappeared, like a clay work that had been pinched. But just as this face was formed, it distorted and melted away. The blurry face from before replaced it, bringing with it an indescribable familiarity and unfamiliarity. Then it distorted, melted, replaced, and the cycle repeated. That's my face? Rumble. Gong Qi's thoughts suddenly left the established track. Amidst the rumbling sounds, he seemed to have crashed off a cliff, tumbling and struggling in the void. It was precisely because of this that he didn't notice that Lady Halder, who had been waiting outside for a long time, had once again controlled the bloody light and silently charged forward. Gong Qi fell into a state of uncontrollable thinking. There were many things he understood, but there were still many things he didn't understand. But no matter what, that turbid and malevolent truth that contained great cruelty and great terror smashed into the depths of his heart, transforming into a demonic claw that fiercely clawed at him. The front of the essence Qi was still in front of him. That incomparably familiar face was trembling and stirring. Even if it was a living person, even if it was a transcendent, 99% of them would still die. Lady Halder's aura was rapidly weakening, but Gong Qi was also rapidly weakening. This was a weakening of the spiritual plane to the point of collapse. The barrier of will shattered with a rumble. His emotions were like an erupting volcano, exploding with destructive flames and emitting a sharp howl in the chaotic spiritual world. Lady Halder closed in, and the bloody light pierced into the depths of the azure-gray essence Qi that had just gathered. But in the next moment, the azure-gray light exploded outwards. Freezing and exploding, two completely different types of killing power simultaneously struck Lady Halder's body. The bloody light condensed and then exploded. Lady Halder's already badly damaged body seemed to have been stripped of all flesh and blood. All that was left was a twisted skeleton that was still burning fiercely. But it was this twisted burning skeleton that firmly absorbed the azure-gray essence Qi in front of it. It was as if it had been smeared with superglue, or perhaps it had been thoroughly magnetized. Deputy Secretary General Gong, you don't have a chance anymore. The repeated declaration was like a poisoned blade that pierced through him a second time. Gong Qi roared. He wanted to tear apart Lady Halder, who was twisting around him. At the same time, he wanted to tear apart the rapidly weakening, but still tenaciously existing nightmarish face. But he was also weakening. At the core of his spiritual body, a shadow of nothingness was rapidly spreading out. It was like a plant that devoured flesh and blood. After growing stronger in secret, it would reveal its malevolent face and openly inject poison into his blood, carrying out a terrifying transformation. Behind the fury was fear. After 2 violent struggles, Gongqi was still unable to break free from Lady Halder, nor was he able to resist the swallowing of the shadow at the bottom of his heart. Then, his emotions would naturally overturn, and a cold wind of fear would blow into the cracks in his collapsed heart. It was quite ironic that his thoughts returned at this moment. Gongqi completely understood. His opponent's main direction of attack had never been the suppression of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. It wasn't Lady Halder. It wasn't the extraordinary that had driven him mad. His opponent had been corroding his mind from beginning to end, injecting a fatal poison into the depths of his heart. This was similar to the methods of the Darksider species. It was the ultimate move that the apex masters of the mind were proficient in. Luo Nan was a master of the mind. Gongqi suddenly stirred. This was the first time he had given the youth a clear position. Seeing his opponent clearly was tantamount to seeing himself clearly. In his days, he seemed to have grasped a thread of hope. Although Luo Nan held the upper hand, he had used all his trump cards. He had no backup plans. This place wasn't far from Spring City. Right now, 2 great combat powers were tangling with him. The Blood Soul Temple's domain had ruptured open during the battle. It was hard to isolate the inside from the outside. Even if he couldn't teleport away, he just needed to slow down and drag out the deadlock. The aura of an extraordinary would most likely be able to attract the attention of others. The ground shook. It was as if a drum was heavily pounding on his chest. The lava cavern was shaking. The source of the shaking came from the turbulence of the structure of the void. Gray mist was seeping in from a certain part of the broken domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The crack that the Blood Soul ants had pierced through and fixed in place. It was clearly only wisps, but the moment it seeped in, the high temperature and pressure of the infernal inferno was smeared with a layer of indescribable gray matter. The luminosity of the entire lava cavern suddenly dimmed. Gongqi's mind trembled. This was because he was certain that these wisps of gray mist came from the mist maze he had just escaped from not too long ago. This wasn't mist. It was a domain fragment. It was a space-time structural element that was refined to the extreme. The change in luminosity of the lava cavern only proved one thing. These refined space-time components were rapidly infiltrating and fusing with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. There were practically no conflicts at all in this grand and complex project that made one's scalp go numb. Even if there were, they would be adjusted at an inconceivable speed. This series of processes looked like scribbles that were casually drawn, but the final result was clearly the most exquisite of meticulous paintings. In terms of the construction of space-time, this was a gap that made one despair. And what was even more despairing was that the gap in the domain that had just been exposed had already been completely mended in the time of a few breaths. Its tenacity was even greater than before. Could it be that he had to be called a space-time master in addition to a spiritual master? Gongqi's spiritual senses wandered around blankly. In the depths of his mind, a shadow that was like a moldy and rotten lump continued to expand. Perhaps it was because he had assimilated to a certain level, but for the first time, he clearly captured that invisible towering frame net. His mind probed and was immediately enveloped by a blazing light. The sun, the seemingly familiar sun of the abyss. In the dark and boundless deep sky, the sun sat in the center. Spider webs weaved densely and bloody light flowed. That was the frequent exchange and transformation of vitality and origin energy. A considerable portion of it came from his body. At this moment, Gongqi was clearly a mosquito that had been tied up into a cocoon. Countless spider webs entangled him and countless nodes were digested. There was no chance or hope for him. Gongqi suddenly let out another roar. The scene of the spiritual world collapsed amidst the roar and he returned to the plane of reality. Before his eyes was a dark red space. It was the embryonic form of some domain. The local space-time, the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, and the domain fragment of the Misty Labyrinth. If these three structures completely converged and fused together, this would be the extraordinary domain. It would not be an exaggeration to call Luo Nan a space-time master at that time. But right now, he was still a bit short. The crux of the matter lay in the fact that no powerful person in the world could evolve into a domain with just a strand of thought. This proved that Luo Nan, the psychic and space-time genius, was here. Perhaps he had just arrived, or perhaps he had been hiding here for a long time. In any case, the youth was here. He was within the range of his attack and slaughter. Ever since the battle began, Gong Qi's mind had never been this clear and this focused. Death was a foregone conclusion, and the final hindrance vanished in a puff of smoke. His extraordinary level mental senses radiated the most penetrating rays of light, illuminating this extremely vast yet imperfect void. Then Gong Qi caught a glimpse of a figure. That figure should also be in a spirit body state. A sharp howl rang out, and the green-gray essence energy instantly ignited and purified. It was just like how it pierced through the extraordinary body. It burned with hatred and fury, tempered into the sharpest of spears and swords, and shot across the sky. Die! Gong Qi had already exhausted everything he had in this fearless attack, including the teleportation technique that he had been unable to use due to the interference of the domain. Thus, he erased practically all of the distance between them. The spear and sword of essence energy had already arrived in front of the target's face. The abyssal region, no, an even higher region, operated marvelously. The spirit body figure that originally existed in the world suddenly rose to a higher level, taking a step upwards. This step was from the real to the virtual. This step was beyond the reach of his strength. Gong Qi burst forth with another howl, and at this moment he suddenly saw a pair of unfamiliar and cold eyes. The eyes were extremely close, yet they were very far away. It was loathsome. Gong Qi instinctively wanted to destroy these eyes, but in this instant, it was as if he had fallen into a long, winding river. He went against the waves and struggled forward, but he was swept even further away by the torrent of water. The ice-cold waves washed over him, taking away his energy and vitality, taking away his life force and spiritual light, taking away his emotions and thoughts, taking away everything that should be a life. All that was left was old, decaying, and other worthless things. Gong Qi howled and struggled forward. Finally, he saw a slightly familiar face. It was one of his most profound memories before he fell into the cloud world. It was the girl who attracted him to Xia City, the girl who was worth 2,000th of the shares of the Deep Blue Project. He did not know that his thoughts and the corresponding state of mind formed a nearly perfect mirror image of Jin Tong, who had fiercely fought him before his death. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.